Wall Street. The early 2000s. The world's financial centre and home to hedge funds and investment banks posting staggering returns. Times had never been so good.
Banks were making enormous amounts of profits. There is actually a very nice graph that shows what was happening to the growth rate of all other industries combined and what was happening to the growth rate of the banking industry. It was surpassing vast majority of the industries which are known to actually be outperforming. Everybody was questioning, how are these banks making so much money?
Dr. Sumit Agarwal worked on Wall Street, and like any banker at that time, he lived extravagantly.
I used to be at Bank of America between 2000 and 2006. We would go out for dinners, and those dinners could easily cost anywhere from $1,000 to $7,000, $8,000. So this gives you a sense of how much money the banks were making. Everybody wants to have a big house and a big car, and they want to show off to the other banker. So you can imagine the enormous profits and no accountability.
The amounts of money that bankers operate with are so astronomical that sometimes even they themselves, right, the analysts and the traders and the brokers, to them it becomes just numbers.
Wall Street players thrived on these numbers, and some of the biggest moneymakers on this block, the investment bankers, the golden boys of the industry.
All investment banks were very aggressive players throughout the 2000s, and rightfully so. I mean, these guys were living the good life. They were known to make money for investors and shareholders.
And the good times were not just rolling in the US. In Asia, the economy was beginning to boom after the 1997 financial crash, and Wall Street titans wanted a piece of the action. And Singapore was becoming an especially attractive Asian destination for America's growing banking wealth.
There was a period of banking liberalization in Singapore, which meant that more foreign banks, such as Standard Chartered, Citibank, for instance, were allowed greater market participation in the retail sector. So the commercial banks in Singapore were all facing essentially greater competition from one another in competing for the customer base.
Top American investment banks piled in to take advantage of the new opportunities. Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and also Lehman Brothers, the oldest of the lot and famed for the strong culture of its US operations.
Lehman Brothers was a significant and important player in the 2000s in the US, in the investment banking industry. At that time, it was number 4. Lehman also was one of the most aggressive players in the industry. People, kids, MBAs, students would love to go and work for Lehman. I mean, this was a prime job for them.
Selathorai Sukumaran joined Lehman Brothers in 2006 as a vice president in the Mergers and Acquisitions Group in New York. The firm was at the height of its success.
Lehman had a very strong culture, a lot of pride in every employee in working for Lehman Brothers. There was always a lot of confidence that Lehman could take on the bigger competitors and win.
Founded in 1850, Lehman was the remarkable survivor. The Great Depression, 2 world wars, and it was still making money. Over the years, Lehman's bankers had gained a reputation for being the toughest of them all.
Now's a terrific time to be joining Lehman Brothers. I've been here 30 years, but I can't think of a better time for you to take part in the changes and opportunities that are going on here.
Once you were there, nothing was really impossible to achieve. You had a lot of faith in the firm, a lot of faith in your managers, a lot of faith in your peers, and a lot of faith in the client's confidence in your work. No one really feared taking on competition, taking on tough transactions, whereas I've seen in other places where people would just walk away from a battle without giving it a shot.
But in 2006, no one on Wall Street was walking away from an exciting new market opportunity. The federal government had lowered interest rates, which allowed both banks and consumers to borrow more money.
Are you looking to buy or refinance your home? Come to Lending Street, where we make the mortgage process easy and understandable.
Americans were also encouraged to own a house, and this drove the housing demand. As house prices kept going up, it seemed a one-way bet to making millions.
I was working on what was happening to mortgages of Bank of America. We were actually seeing aggressive growth in the mortgage industry. We were lending, we were looking for borrowers. This was a new opportunity that was created because of the role of securitization.
Securitization was the brainchild of the new generation of bankers. It started with homeowners, the common men on the street. Each month, they paid mortgages to mortgage lenders. Wanting to make more money, the lenders would then sell the mortgages to investment banks. The mortgage contracts were then bundled by these investment banks, like Lehman Brothers, with other loans to create a new financial product called collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. Unknown to most homeowners, their mortgage payments that were packaged with other loans were then sold and traded to institutional buyers all over the globe. Securitization became the tool that turned mortgage payments into even more wealth for financial empires. Business tripled over 6 years. In 2006 alone, the top 10 investment bankers sold $1.5 trillion worth of mortgage securities. And even for the regulators, this seemed like the perfect way for more people to live the American dream by owning their own home.
Regulators saw the positive benefits of actually securitization because they saw that credit was being made available to a wider population. Or you can think about credit was being democratized. So nobody actually envisioned that there could be negative effects.
The world's largest banks were now making mind-blowing amounts of money. Bankers were hooked to the profits made and craved even more. Next stop was selling their investment products to Asian countries like Hong Kong and Singapore.
Almost all the banks were pushing different kinds of products to try to attract customers. These products were seen as very attractive because they were sold with the promise that it has quite high yielding interest of about 5%.
In Asia, products like high notes, pinnacle notes, and mini bonds hit the market. When Mr. Tun walked into his local bank with $50,000 and the intention of renewing his savings account, he was offered a chance to join the money-making party. We have protected his identity upon his request.
They see I got this money, they also asked to the salesman in charge in the bank. He just let us sit down, explain to us what they have. They tell me that there's another bond with about 4 to 5% interest. So I asked the brochures, so I asked a check of $500,000, the previous buyer, in the morning. We are convinced and we have been promised that this is a very safe bond.
Like so many other investors, Mr. Tun fully trusted his bank. But what he didn't know was that the product he had invested in was directly linked to top American banks like Lehman Brothers and Merrill Lynch.
Many of the investment banks in the US were actually involved in the structuring and the sales of these structured products. And therefore, what was happening, quite far away in the United States actually had very real impact on the everyday retail investors over here in Asia.
This was to prove problematic. Those top American banks were by now completely entangled in the US mortgage market. But fundamental cracks had begun to appear in this system. Not all homeowners could actually make their mortgage payments. Chris Roebuck is a British economist who has advised major global banks and held senior roles at UBS and HSBC.
It was possible for you to get a mortgage not by presenting any evidence of your earnings at all, but by merely telling the person who was offering you the mortgage how much you were earning. So there was no evidence at all that any of the people that had mortgages could actually afford them.
But to investment bankers, these people were making them money. And banks had even extended their loans to what were termed subprime borrowers.
These are borrowers who would not get credit in normal times. But the banks realize they have so much money, they can actually go out and give credit to these borrowers.
A larger problem was brewing, and no one was anticipating it.
In any society, there are going to be some people who lose their jobs and can't pay. But it was practice. Because the banks made a lot of money out of it, because they thought it was a bottomless pit, everybody rather wanted to ignore the reality that the whole thing might blow up in their faces.
But Dr. Sumit Agarwal, who was still working at Bank of America, could not ignore that reality. He began to feel like it was not the place to be.
In 2006, I could already sense that the banks were making lots and lots of loans that didn't make any sense to me. I felt like it was time to leave this industry and actually go and work for the opposition, which was the Federal Reserve.
Dr. Sumit saw the looming danger. But for others on Wall Street, it was squarely in their blind spot. By the end of 2006, pressures were felt across the mortgage market as housing prices in the US started falling dramatically. It was the beginning of the end.
From that point onwards, to some degree, it was a house of cards.
Lehman Brothers, America's oldest investment bank, was growing fast with offices emerging all around the world and employing over 25,000 people. By 2007, its revenues totaled $19 billion.
It was becoming a powerhouse investment bank, standing on its own, being very independent, and really clocking away very good results in all of its franchises. M&A was number 1, number 2 in the US. Equities was doing well. And these were traditionally not Lehman's stronger suites, but they were really catching up and beating the stronger players in that market. For everyone, Lehman Brothers was a threat.
Lehman Brothers' success could be attributed to one man. His name is Richard Fuld.
Hi, my name is Dick Fuld. I'm the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Lehman Brothers. I'm pleased that you're considering a career in investment banking.
Dick Fuld was a very strong leader. If you take large investment banks, there are anywhere between 25 to 100,000 employees. You will find employees in these large institutions who would not know the name of the CEO. It would be fair to say that every employee at Lehman Brothers knew who the CEO was, and that he was a very passionate leader about the firm, about its franchise, about its team.
Fuld began his colourful career at Lehman Brothers in 1969 on its trading floor. But the feisty character quickly rose through the ranks and became the firm's chief executive in 1993. By 2005, he was taking home more than $34 million in pay and bonuses. This man lived and breathed Lehman Brothers.
Almost 95% of his wealth was in Lehman stock. So people had faith in his leadership. Whatever he was doing for the firm, for the shareholders of the firm, had a very direct impact on his own personal wealth and future. He had a lot of vested interest in making sure that Lehman Brothers did well.
As part of this, Fuld looked to the east to further his money-making aspirations. In 2007, Asia was Lehman's highest growth region. It took in more than $3.1 billion in revenue, having doubled this in just 2 years.
Lehman is the 4th largest investment bank in the US. It had a large presence in Singapore. In fact, we experienced record volumes in 2007. And there was an environment of confidence, easy credit, and people were optimistic.
And this optimism filtered down to consumers and investors like Mr. Tan, who seized the opportunity to build a pot of savings.
The purpose is to save money for old age, to make the money grow in a safe place. They told us that this is the safest place to park the money and earn more. That's why we put there. We just trust the bank.
Those investors did not know the underlying risk in these securities. They didn't know what they were holding. Were they holding subprime mortgages? Were they holding prime mortgages? They were packaging all these things together and selling them as prime securities.
These packaged securities continued making millions for financial giants. But some key players from Lehman's global team grew doubtful. Anthony Fry was the head of Lehman Brothers in the UK.
I think they were in a position where they really believed they were the people in charge of the whole world. They were winning. Everyone else was losing.
Anthony Fry had 35 years of investment banking experience. He even worked closely with Margaret Thatcher. Yet, even then, his knowledge and expertise were challenged. Dick Fult had steered his US operations on a completely different route. The firm borrowed more money than any other bank on Wall Street.
I was in a position that I was fortunate I could say, we won't do that. And they were already talking to me and saying, you're trying to stop this, we want to do X, Y, and Z. We had a fundamental disagreement between them in America and myself working in England, and it got very difficult.
Lehman's chief executive was not letting anyone get in the way of his vision.
Now, this is a guy that, to some degree, is on a personal mission. He's a grandee of Wall Street. He has his own little show, you know. He's been there long enough. He doesn't want anybody getting in the way. It's his focus, his success.
The truth was that he controlled everything. And it was very clear that if he decided that someone wasn't doing what he wanted them to do, he'd fire them.
But if they were loyal to his vision, then he would reward them handsomely. And these salaries incentivized them to take bigger risks.
The remuneration, the pay that people were getting, you've got a situation where these people were effectively being paid to make as much money as quickly as possible. So the psychology is, if this is a safe deal that only makes a little bit of money, or this is a risky deal that makes an awful lot of money, we're so clever that we can control the risk. Or that's what they thought.
In the final months of 2007, cracks in the US housing market deepened. Property prices dropped so much, some houses were worth less than the mortgage itself. And now homeowners who could never actually afford a mortgage to begin with struggled to pay. So many simply stopped paying. The scene looked set for disaster, but the brightest minds on Wall Street still felt they had it under control.
As soon as the house prices started falling in 2007, I wrote a small paper. It was actually a Fed letters where I talked about the subprime crisis, and I said it's not a big issue because subprime loans per se are a very small fraction of the entire mortgages. They are around 10 to 15%. Even if 1/3 or half of them defaulted, that will still amount to around $600 to $700 billion. That's not a big enough number, okay, for a major crisis to happen. You can guess I was totally wrong.
Defaults caused huge problems, but decades of success made banks believe they could ride out this storm. The reality was they lacked the reserves to cope with those losses. And in early 2008, the subprime crisis had claimed its first victim, Bear Stearns, America's 5th largest investment bank. The firm was hit too hard and raised its white flag. A bailout by the US Federal Reserve and JP Morgan Chase worth more than $30 billion pulled the bank back from the brink. But the crisis was far from over. Wall Street's money-making machines were crumbling.
The bull run had finally come to an end.
The financial giants of the world were making billions of dollars on the housing market. But in 2008, alarm bells rang on Wall Street. Bear Stearns, America's fifth largest investment bank, was brought to its knees. And no one saw this coming.
When I went to the office and I heard that Bear Stearns was sold to JP Morgan at a very, very cheap price, it was shocking. It was astonishing. It was unbelievable how this happened, how quickly it happened. That's when we realized that these investment banks actually may have taken excessive risks, and now these risks are actually coming up and coming back to bite these banks.
It was a watershed event, right? So Lehman stock tanked by 48%. That sent a signal that there was more to come. Suddenly the entire sort of stock market tanked a bit. So people's investment portfolio, they were all suddenly, in the reds.
Dr. Sumit Agarwal, who was formerly working at Bank of America, had now become a senior financial economist at the Chicago Federal Reserve. And regulators like him were worried.
So immediately at the Federal Reserve, we started looking at what are the other investment banks doing, what are their portfolios like, could this happen to them as well? And the concern that we had is, because we are not regulating them, we have no idea what these investment banks are up to.
This was a shocking revelation. Financial titans were left to their own devices. Anything could happen, and it could even have global ramifications. In Singapore, financial regulators were also worried about the impact of Bear Stearns' failure on its market.
The fifth largest investment bank going down, it is no mean feat. There must be some pressures going on, and we needed to be on the lookout as to how other investment banks may be similarly affected. In SGX, how we looked at it from a risk management perspective, although Bear Stearns was not a member in our markets, it was evidence to us that there may be some credit concerns.
But one bank, which was a member of SGX, was under increasing strain back on Wall Street. All eyes were now on the next bank on the list, Lehman Brothers.
Everybody in the industry started worrying specifically about Lehman Brothers. Are they well capitalized? Can they sustain this crisis? Do they have enough capital? There were speculations that Lehman Brothers will not be able to weather this crisis.
We didn't think that all of us were going to be saved of our jobs, but we never thought Lehman Brothers would go down. We still felt that if someone like Bear Stearns found a buyer and was bailed by the government, Lehman was bigger than Bear Stearns. So there was a lot of anxiety, but there was some sort of a calm reassurance about being at Lehman.
But by June 2008, this calmness had disappeared. Lehman announced its first quarterly loss in 14 years, a dizzying $2.8 billion US.
So when Lehman Brothers announced that they actually made a loss of $2.8 billion, it was shocking. That is enormous amount of money for any investment bank. Also, you start worrying that when they're announcing that much, what else is happening on their balance sheet? I mean, we were just didn't know what to do at that point. Immediately, we were thinking, what else is happening in this industry?
Within the glass windows of the Lehman office, tensions were running high.
Our days were numbered as we knew it. But I think we never felt the days of Lehman Brothers were numbered. The anxiety was creeping up. People were slowly leaving or were forced to leave. There was an overall skepticism that was creeping in. No place was safe in Wall Street.
But Lehman's chief executive was determined to keep his empire alive at any cost. He made a series of changes, which included raising more money from investors even more so than most other banks on Wall Street.
Other organisations like Goldman's were starting to pull back. And the valid question is, well, why do they keep going? And that is where I think we start getting into culture, the influence of the CEO, and a syndrome that you see in a number of organisations, the fact that we're a good organisation and we know best. It gets to the point that what we look for in senior leaders is self-confidence. Now, sometimes that self-confidence becomes arrogance.
As early as 2007, some were already voicing opposition to Fould's approach.
Well, I was saying sell, sell, sell. They were saying buy, buy, buy. And that was a view. Now, could I have got it different? I wasn't in a position to do it. I wasn't the chief executive of the whole lot to decide that. He had a view that this was the right thing to do, double it up. I was cutting loss and run.
And what's happening is that the data they're getting is causing flashing lights and bells to ring, but because they are so focused on their own objectives, they ignore all of that. Lehman's was trying to act as if it could get away with it, but it had got itself into the position that it was just too exposed.
Then why did Dick Fould continue to gamble? Had Lehman's earlier success blinded its leaders from seeing the possibility of failure?
They thought the right thing to do is get even more money involved in that, because we will make an absolute huge amount of money if we're right. The problem was they were wrong, and it costs everything.
Just 3 months later, what unravelled were repercussions of Lehman's grave mistakes. On 10th September 2008, Dick Fould released a press statement that read, "This is an extraordinary time for our industry and one of the toughest periods in the firm's history." Wall Street's oldest investment bank reported a staggering loss of almost $4 billion that day. For Lehman Brothers, it was all going wrong.
I think the first thought that probably crept into everyone's mind was that we were going to be part of a bigger bank, and we were going to lose the culture of Lehman Brothers. Because Lehman Brothers was fiercely independent as a firm. I think it was a sobering reality facing us, staring at our face. That Lehman as a firm, the culture that we were so fiercely proud of, was not going to be there anymore. That, I think, sunk in very quickly.
Outside of Wall Street, the rest of the world held their breath as they watched the series of events unfold. In Singapore, the SGX anticipated the worst.
It became evident to us that we are at a critical juncture. We did the necessary risk management activities. We looked at the exposures that Lehman has in our system. We did the necessary, worked out stress, performed various simulations to determine what could go wrong, what will happen if it goes really, really wrong. It was a lot of interaction between us and Lehman management, where we made sure that we took the necessary precautions with them. The conversations were not easy. They were difficult, but necessary.
On Friday, 12th September in New York, US Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson held more difficult conversations with Wall Street's top executives. How could they save Lehman Brothers? Could they even be saved? As the day progressed, one thing became clear. Unlike Bear Stearns, there would be no federal bailout for Lehman Brothers.
Some regulators were worried of the moral hazard problem in trying to save Lehman Brothers. If we go out and save Lehman Brothers, who will be next? Every other investment bank would want to say that I'm in trouble, go out and save me. So as an economist, I was saying, why do we need to go out and save these rich investment bankers? It makes no sense, and using taxpayer money.
Dr. Sumit and his colleagues were also working that weekend and analysing potential solutions.
I was just looking at mortgages. What is the implications? What is the balance sheets of these banks? We hardly know where the bodies are buried in these banks. So we want to help them, but we had one hand tied behind our back. Cannot do anything, cannot do much. Whatever they tell you, we have to believe it.
Meanwhile, Dick Fuld was running out of time. He only had 2 days before the Asian markets opened on Monday morning to save his empire. He turned to Bank of America and Britain's Barclays Bank for help.
Anything could have happened over the weekend. They could have found a nice suitor in a commercial bank to buy Lehman. There could be an injection of capital through the Federal Reserve. There were many speculations that actually Lehman can collapse. Lehman was vehemently arguing that collapsing is not an option, it will have huge ramifications.
Whether Lehman would collapse eventually without anyone to bail it out never crossed anyone's mind. I don't think it would have crossed anyone's mind at that time.
But reality was hitting hard. Both Barclays and Bank of America pulled out. Lehman Brothers was at the edge of bankruptcy. Back in Singapore, Agnes Koh led her team through stressful times.
It was tense. Trust me, it was tense. As early, I think, on Sunday evening, word got out that there was no deal brokered and Lehman will likely file Chapter 11. We went into an overdrive, came into the office late into the night, looked at all the positions and performed various simulations, stress events as to what can go really, really wrong on Monday morning.
It was Monday morning on 15th September 2008. The Asian markets just opened, and everyone was taking in the news. Lehman Brothers was bankrupt. Its debt, $613 billion.
It was shocking. There is no other word you can use that the regulators, everybody else was shocked. Nobody anticipated that the Fed and the Treasury will actually let Lehman collapse. Everybody thought that these guys are so big to fail that there will be a solution to save them.
At 745 7th Avenue in New York, Lehman employees were seen leaving the building with boxes of their belongings. Sukumaran was especially affected by Lehman's demise.
I was very upset. I just was in disbelief. I couldn't believe that a 157-year-old firm had just become a thing of a part of history. And I think I still was carrying my gym bags, Lehman Brothers, my business cards. I still had probably leftover business cards there. It's just like, someone died.
With Lehman's collapse, the products sold to investors in places like Hong Kong and Singapore lost most of their value. Thousands of ordinary people stood to lose millions.
I give the gut, then got a heart attack.
The fall of Lehman Brothers was the biggest bankruptcy in history that cast a sense of dread across the industry and beyond.
The failure of Lehman's at that specific point in time, for a few days afterwards, was like the entire global financial and business system looking over the precipice. Nobody knew, probably for a week to 2 weeks, what was going to happen next. Bear Stearns had gone, Lehman's had gone. Everybody was waiting for the next domino to fall. And everybody was worried that if the next domino goes, the whole lot will go.
The music had stopped for the players on Wall Street. And with it came a sudden and remarkable clarity.
So once Lehman's had gone, That galvanized everybody. Financial services institutions, IMF, governments, to say, hang on, we really are on the brink of Armageddon here. So it doesn't matter, personal animosities, competitive advantage, this is out the window. You know, either we all get together and sort this now, or effectively the world's financial system is going to implode. Therefore, to some degree, you know, you could say that Lehman's was the sacrificial lamb that got everybody back to a sense of reality. It was the ultimate reality check.
In Singapore, panic had not yet taken hold. Investors remained unaware of what they had gotten themselves into. They were at risk of losing their entire investment.
The reason the Lehman crisis in the US affected Singapore was because of how these notes, like the high notes and mini bonds, were structured. For example, in high notes, they were linked to 8 different entities, one of which was Lehman. And when I say linked, what that means is if any of those entities defaulted, that would mean that the notes that these investors had purchased would also default. And once these notes defaulted, the investors will not get their principal amount back.
Siraj Omar was a lawyer who represented more than 200 investors who lost all their money when Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Mr. Tan, who had invested $50,000 in mini bonds, suffered a similar fate. He watched the crisis unfold on the news. Petrified, he headed to his local bank to cash out his money.
So we go there, we ask them what happened to our money. They say it's safe and sound, not to worry. You still get what we are promised. So we just trust the bank, we go back. All their money, hard-earned money, is inside. Of course, they want to withdraw their money. But the bank say no, you cannot do anything. At a point of time, we don't know what is Lehman Brother or sister. But end of the day, the boat sink even more. After that, they refuse to see us. They want to talk to you.
Some investors became frustrated with the uncertainty of what happened to their investments. In October 2008, almost 1,000 people took their frustration to Hong Lim Park, Singapore's only platform for public demonstrations.
In the year of 2008, up to that point, it was the biggest demonstration that was ever held in Hong Lim Park. So, and I think that was quite an accurate reflection of the public sentiment around the event and how upset and anxious people were. There were people who have lost entire life savings, $100,000, $200,000, people who were elderly, a number of them that were interviewed by journalists as well during that time were speaking in Mandarin or in other Chinese dialects. So they clearly were not very well versed in English and couldn't really understand the prospectuses and the bank documents that they were signing at that time. In that case, didn't really fully understand the full risks and characteristics of the product that they were buying.
And Mr. Tan was one of many who did not fully understand the complex documents he had signed. Little did he know that this ordeal would lead to a painful awakening.
We talked to the management, then after talking for a while, they just refused to talk further. I refused to leave. Then they get the gut to chase us out, force us out. Then start argument. Then I feel that heart tight. And then just lie down on the floor. Very giddy, like fainting. So call for ambulance.
Mr. Tan suffered a heart attack. The stress was too much to bear. For investors like him, there was little to no support from the banks or authorities.
So I had to pay for my bill for the hospital. Very emotional, very sad that this thing happened. People had money, and the bank still making a lot of money. You still do this kind of thing to your loyal customer that give you business.
While retail investors all around the world were suffering from the enormous loss of money, Wall Street titans still came out of the crisis with millions in their pockets. Dick Fult appeared at an official inquiry after Lehman's collapse.
But you get to keep $480 million. I have a very basic question for you. Is this fair?
But Fult deflected the question, offering no response except to correct the figure to a little less than $250 million.
Everyone just sat there thinking, oh my God, we are in a big problem here. It was amusing, but it tells a lot about quite a large number of people who work for him still believe that actually it was all a mistake. They'd done nothing wrong. They should be doing this job.
But you don't seem to acknowledge that you did anything wrong. And that, I think, is also troubling to me.
It was evident the investment bankers, who had been living the high life for so long, were far removed from the plight of the common man.
These top executives had made so much money in their lifetime. Investment bankers only cared about profit. They didn't care about what implications it has on people's lives. It's true that investment banking attracts the best and the brightest of minds from the top universities in America. But arrogance among these people can make them believe they're untouchable.
The analysts and the traders and the brokers, to them it becomes just numbers. They become so disconnected that it becomes just numbers. So therefore, until something really hits the common people, it's very difficult to recognize that these huge numbers in the billions and the trillions that are being tossed around amongst these investment banks actually do have real, everyday social impact.
Their actions led nearly 10,000 people in Singapore to lose their life savings, a total of almost $340 million. But could Singapore have avoided this mess? Where did it go wrong?
There was a lot of drive to want to develop Singapore's financial center capacity. So part of that was to encourage everyday investors to be more sophisticated in terms of investing in financial products. But perhaps part of the problem is that maybe the pace was a little bit too quick.
People didn't quite understand what they were investing in. And I think the feeling was that the banks and financial institutions could do more to ensure that people understood. They could explain these products a bit better. And I think steps have been taken in that direction.
After further investigations into the mini-bond crisis in Singapore, the Monetary Authority, or MAS, instituted tighter regulations in the hope that this would not happen again. The MAS also took some punitive measures against the local banks that were involved in distributing these products. Banks were banned from selling any such products for a period of up to 2 years. But was this enough for those hit hardest?
After 8 years, of course, you have to forget everything. Life go on, no choice. What can we do? They're still around. They're still making a lot of money, but we're still angry over the past, no use. What can I do? Let's be more careful.
Mr. Tun's experience showed how one bank's collapse could affect the lives of ordinary people living thousands of kilometers away. It's been 8 years since Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Wall Street has recovered. The global financial industry is a juggernaut once more. Despite their struggles, investors have found ways to move on. Yet the question remains, could this happen again?
I can also tell you with high degree of confidence that we will see a banking crisis again. Bankers have very short-term memory. Crisis is over, they are back into making profits, and soon greed will take over. They will forget what happened 10 years ago, and we'll see another crisis. And when a crisis happens next time, I would suspect it will be bigger than what we have.
Leeson came to the City of London with one thing in mind: to make a lot of money. So he swapped his working-class roots for the highbrow and elitist world of investment banking.
I genuinely believe, and I still believe it to this day, if you sit me down to do a task with somebody else, I'll do it better and quicker than them.
At only 24 years old, he had the cockiness and charisma to succeed. But Leeson had a more sinister trait. He had the ability to deceive some of the most powerful people in finance. This is the story of how one man's ego and the greed of Britain's oldest bank conspired to lose over $1 billion US, and in the process, destroy one of the most prestigious investment empires in the world. Nick Leeson had a modest upbringing, living with his mum in the suburbs of London.
My mum had always instilled an ambition in me from an early age to achieve at school, to achieve at senior school, and then to achieve in life. And I think the things that she was very much focused on were me having a better life than she had. You know, my upbringing was very, very working class, and you know, money was always in short supply.
But Leeson was a man destined for bigger things, and in April 1992, he got his dream job in Singapore. He would trade for Barings Bank on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, the SIMEX, and it gave him the glamour and attention he craved.
The trading floor is amazingly exciting. People are competing against each other in a gladiatorial sort of environment where, you know, one person wins and another person loses, and you're trying to prove that you're the best.
The SIMEX, which later merged to become SGX, was a cutting-edge exchange that specialised in futures contracts. These are bets on the future direction of the market. In Leeson's case, it was the Nikkei 225 index. If he correctly predicted its direction, he could make a lot of money. But if he was wrong, he stood to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars.
The markets are always very active. You know, there's lots of uncertainty, and that uncertainty becomes, for a lot of people, bordering on addictive because you're always on edge in terms of what's going to happen. But it's the most exciting part of the industry.
He was beginning to make a name for himself in the financial world, and his success caught the eye of John Gapper.
Pretty rapidly, he built up a reputation as being one of the better traders on the floor, even one of the best. He was very forceful, he could always get you a good price, and customers came to like him. And then over time, because he seemed to be so good at that business, he was given more leeway to trade for himself, to trade for Barings.
Ian Lowe was an independent trader on the exchange. He traded against Nick Leeson on a daily basis.
I recall one incident when I was standing there with my friend looking at Nikkei chart. Nick Leeson went by, he knew us quite well, and then he half-jokingly, he said, "Ian, no need to look at the chart." So I said, "Why?" "I plot the chart. Look at me. If I wanted to buy, the market would go up. If I wanted to sell, it would go down. So why bother with the chart?"
If you have any success in any business, it's, you know, the most wonderful feeling. People are trying to transact as much as they possibly can, so it becomes an addictive quality that you know your body starts to hunger for because you're so used to it happening.
Leeson worked for Barings Securities, a very different branch within Barings Brothers that specialised in new cutting-edge markets. Set up in 1985, they started as a group of just 6 traders, but 7 years later, they accounted for over half the bank's profits. The traditional bankers at Barings Brothers were a little surprised by the way they did business.
Barings Securities were a set of people who regarded the bankers of Barings Brothers as being rather stiff and establishment and stuffy. Sometimes the people within Barings Brothers would raise their eyebrows and say they're a bit wild.
Barings Brothers was Britain's oldest merchant bank, and in its 233-year history, a long line of traditional bankers had prided themselves on stability and authority. You could trust them to look after your money with utmost security. Even the Queen held an account with Barings.
It was very much a kind of respectable, upper-class, comfortable establishment bank. It traded on its name and its reputation, the sense that it was really emblematic of the City of London.
But the City of London was changing. The fashionable way to make money in the 90s was through aggressive trading on the stock markets. Barings Securities were ruthless investors, and Nick Leeson was their newest and most ambitious recruit.
It was very much a sink or swim type of mentality, which was perfect for me because that was the sort of opportunity that I wanted. There was no real support, there was no real guidance, there was no mentoring, if you like, for anything that was going on. It was very much on the job, on the desk training, and it was certainly creating an environment that was good for me, somebody that was hungry, that was competitive and that wanted to get to the top.
Yet behind the scenes, Barings Securities had big problems. It was a company with very few controls.
It wasn't a particularly well-run organisation from an operational perspective because the focus was always very much on doing the business, being first and getting as much of the business as they possibly could. It's about gaining that competitive advantage. You do that at the expense of not having the systems and the controls and the people in place to make sure that your business is safe.
At Barings Securities, Nick Leeson was allowed to occupy both the general manager and head of settlements, jobs that would normally be done by two different people.
Allowing Leeson to do that is one of the most obviously stupid things you could do. It breaks rule number 1 of financial control. It meant that at the end of each day, Leeson could value his own positions and control the bank accounts, and there was nobody checking on what he was doing, and it meant that he had an enormous amount of freedom.
Barings knew this was a precarious situation. In 1993, an internal memo sent between senior staff warned, "We are in danger of setting up a system which could prove disastrous." And Nick Leeson was prepared to exploit that. In 1992, the world markets fluctuated violently, and Leeson's young and inexperienced team began to make a series of critical mistakes.
The business had exploded in Singapore. We didn't have enough people picking up the phones, we didn't have enough people order filling. So it was very much every hand to the pump, if you like, and we'd recently employed a young girl who worked on the floor, and she was picking up phones, which wasn't really her responsibility.
The orders started from a phone call. They need to pass it on to the order fillers through hand signal. So the signal will start by telling the order filler whether I'm a buyer or seller. So this is selling, followed by the price, this is 40, and then followed by the quantity, this is 100. So it will go seller, 40, 100. It was a very tedious process and prone to mistake and not very efficient.
At the end of one day in July 1992, Leeson's team showed a loss of $60,000 US. The normal procedure is to immediately inform Barings' head office in London. But Leeson didn't do that.
The thought process at that time, when we realised that was exposure, was I had to do something with it, right? But it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, there's people just gone home in London. There's nobody in the office in Singapore. So I'm very much to my own devices. So there's an exposure, but there's nothing I can do about it.
Leeson hid the loss in a secret company account, known as the 5/8 account. This was completely against company rules. He was now a rogue trader.
I'd seen it before. You know, it wasn't a case of being calculated and clear about what you were doing. This was something that I'd witnessed on a daily basis working in Barings. You know, how many times had people put something into an error account, held it overnight or for a week, and then unwound it? Numerous. For me, that should have been a huge step to do that, but it wasn't. It was a baby step because I'd seen everybody do it during my time in the organisation.
Yet Leeson maintains he was merely protecting one of his junior employees.
I was worried about the girl that worked for me on the trading floor, and I didn't want her to lose her job.
Well, bollocks is all I can say. I don't think that's the truth. I certainly don't think it's anything like the whole truth.
Peter Norris, based in London, was Leeson's senior manager.
I know that's what he's always said about what happened, but the facts are that absolutely from the outset, he created a situation in which transactions could be hidden. Now, he then says that that was all about covering up for mistakes junior people made. Well, I'm not sure about that, at the very least.
The main thing that was happening was that Leeson wanted to appear to be a star trader, and the way that you appear to be a star trader is to make money, and the easiest way to make money is to make it up.
Barings' star trader was hiding a dark secret that no one else could know about. A secret that would drive Leeson to the brink of destruction.
I think it may have been sort of a vainglorious thing. It gave him a huge buzz to be the biggest guy on the floor.
It seemed Barings Securities were the biggest traders in Singapore. But in reality, their profits were based on the lies of one man. Nick Leeson was hiding multi-million-dollar losses in his secret 5/8 account. He would then try to win the money back on the exchange. But that didn't work. Over the next couple of months, the market went against Leeson on almost a daily basis, and his losses grew wildly. Now Leeson had an even bigger problem. He'd run out of cash to fund his trading.
The first time that I had to ask London for funding was on the year end in September 1992. We had a $5 million loss. I had no way of hiding it. And so I simply picked up the phone and asked London for $5 million. What reason did I give them? I told them that it was because of volatility in the market and the exchange was looking for additional margin.
He set out to deceive, and it remained undetected for a number of reasons. And he was clearly very adept at keeping the ball rolling with his colleagues, with all the falsification of records and so on that had to happen every day. He was pretty good at it.
The London HQ needed proof of Leeson's new clients. But these clients didn't exist. So Leeson made them up. It was basic forgery.
It was a simple cut and paste job, so it was the confirmation that was required on top of a letter that bore the signature of the person that was due to sign it. One stuck on top of the other, photocopied and faxed to whoever it needed to be faxed.
Under his instruction, Leeson's team began a daily routine of deception. And by January 1993, Barings senior management had sent him over $60 million.
People think that it was a real complex process in terms of achieving the funding that we required from London. It was a very, very simple process. One of the girls who worked for me in the office, she would come in first thing, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, open up the Citibank account, see how overdrawn we were, and request that sum of money from London. So if we were 50 million overdrawn, she would request 50 million. All of them were nonsensical. There was not one of them that would stand up to any investigation.
Yet the senior management in London believed every single word.
Yes. These figures were reported daily. I think the people who were directly concerned with oversight in Singapore had a great deal of confidence in Nick, and for that reason allowed him a considerable latitude in what he did.
Yeah, there is a lot of greed, there's a lot of self-deception, there's quite a lot of illusion, and there was a lot of ignorance and even innocence, actually, about what was happening. It seems almost incredible with hindsight that nobody actually said, this is a fraud. And yet, they didn't. And I think that they didn't know it was a fraud, but they almost didn't want to accept it themselves. They wanted to believe.
Leeson was trapped in a daily ritual of deception and lies. The 5/8 account had become a monster. In January 1993, it concealed losses of over $35 million US.
You do genuinely wake up, or you sit there for every minute of every day and you expect somebody to knock on the door, or you expect somebody to pick up the phone and ask a difficult question. You expect somebody to look at the accounts and interrogate it and see that there are holes in the balance sheet.
So absolutely certain he was aware of what he was doing. It took a great deal of thought every day to make it work. It must have been an awful thing for him every day, because he would know in the morning that he had to end the day having concealed everything that he needed to conceal again. The stress must have been enormous.
Within investment banks, people make losses, they try to hide them, they think they can trade out of them. But they usually try for a couple of weeks and then either get out of them or they hold their hands up to their bosses and say, I made a mistake. The interesting thing about Leeson is, despite the intense psychological pressure he was under, he carried on. He didn't stop. And that is the thing that's most perplexing about rogue trader.
Alan Bloom is an expert at forensically analysing business accounts and working out what went wrong.
The reason why banks insist that employees, especially trading employees, go on holiday from time to time is because fraudsters can't possibly ever go on holiday, because if they go on holiday, it unravels. It's written into the contracts of banks that they have to go on holiday for 2 consecutive weeks. And those are quite common sense things. Now, some of those everybody knew about in 1995, but some of those arose from Barings. So the whole world learnt a lot of lessons from Barings, unfortunately. Barings cost.
Leeson never took a holiday while he was working in Singapore, and his fraud wasn't finished. In April 1993, he doubled up. He bought hundreds more contracts without the bank knowing. If the market moved his way, then he could make millions. It was a huge gamble.
My own focus was surviving for another day, trying to get back to a situation where there were no losses and start again. It's very strange and it's difficult to explain it, but slowly over a period of time, and people aren't knocking on the door and they're not asking those difficult questions, you get a little bit more comfortable with it. You don't get comfortable with the fact that you're losing money, but you get comfortable with the fact that you've got more time to correct it. And you gain this strange sort of confidence that you will be able to unwind it.
Dr. Elizabeth Nair specialises in business psychology.
The whole aspect of dispositional greed is that the person is motivated by impulses. Let me do this. I can do this. I am the best. I have been the best, and I can be again. Let me just do this again. It's as if the person is unable to be clear-headed and to understand that I am fallible.
But suddenly, Leeson's luck changed. His gamble had paid off, and he won back over $20 million US.
It resulted in a $250,000 profit, as opposed to a $20 million loss. And I genuinely went home that weekend believing that that was it. Nobody's found anything that's been going on to this point. Nobody needs to find anything that's going to go on from this point because there isn't going to be anything. Let's go home this weekend and really celebrate. And we did. And on the Monday morning, there's another error, and the whole sorry episode starts again.
I mean, how mad was that? He could have shut the book. Never have had to have done any of that again. And he couldn't make himself. Extraordinary.
You're in a totally different mindset at that point. You've done this once. You've overcome it once. And whilst, yes, the first thing that you should do is go back and notify London of what's going on, I've just got out of a 20 million hole, which gives me this strange confidence that, you know, I'm now looking at a much smaller loss and I should be able to sort that out very quickly the following day. But that doesn't happen.
The greatest fear would be losing out and not being the best and looking like a failure. It is not so much that they believe or think that they have not made a mistake. It is the refusal to admit to having made a mistake. And they try and hide it even to themselves.
I think it may have been sort of a vainglorious thing. It gave him a huge buzz to be the biggest guy on the floor. I really can't think of any other motivation.
I think he wanted and liked being seen as a star trader. He'd come from the back office, he'd come from quite humble circumstances, and he'd managed to make something of himself, and he didn't want to just go back to where he'd come from.
Leeson was a man losing control, spiralling deeper and deeper into his world of lies. There was no escape.
Post-May 1993, the volume of trading coming through Singapore is increasing. The trades are getting bigger, the market's moving more drastically. The market's falling from 40,000 down to 18,000. So any position that you're holding is really accelerated in terms of the loss that it's making. And I'm holding bigger and bigger positions. So it's just getting more and more crazy. Nothing was stopping this train. It was running off the tracks.
September 1994. It's been over 2 years since Leeson's first error on the Cymex. That initial $60,000 US loss had ballooned to over 320 million, and the psychological pressure was escalating.
The losses are just getting totally out of control. It does become absolute pure avoidance. The statement, somebody would leave it on my desk, I'd hide it in the drawer without looking at it. Burying my head in the sand more and more. It was almost as if it was going to hurt me if I touched it. Then it was just pure survival. You know, I was waiting for this eureka moment, but I still couldn't tell people what was going on.
Leeson was the only man who knew the complete truth. Everyone thought he was making millions of dollars. In September 1994, Cymex celebrated its 10th anniversary, and Barings Bank received an award for its success on the exchange.
We won a big award on Cymex in 1994 for the highest customer volume. My 5/8 account was 95% of that volume. So what were they believing? You know, the inclination was to believe. You know, where profit is motivation, the inclination is to believe.
It was good for Cymex. They liked Leeson because he was producing trade. He was making them look bigger. And so they themselves had an incentive to keep it going. Clearly, they didn't know that there was a fraud happening, but they too were incentivized not to look too closely.
You've got the board of Barings. They wanted to make more money. You've got my wife and friends who believe that I have this fantastic life and being this exceptionally successful trader. You've got other organisations, other banks who are trying to employ me because I am the alpha trader of the Singapore exchange at the time. Everybody was so bought into the success story that surrounded me, it was just impossible to say, look lads, stop, everybody stop. And it in a strange way, it catapults you along. And it is, you know, for me, somebody who was so focused on success, had such an exalted opinion of what success looked like. Somebody who had couldn't deal with failure. That constant conflict, I just couldn't deal with it. And it was a case of going along for the ride, because it was impossible to say stop.
Leeson was living a Jekyll and Hyde existence. Behind his false success, there was catastrophic failure.
The day-to-day fear is, it's very difficult to live. You have to cope and survive with it sometimes. So alcohol is the constant way that you cope with it, and that gets worse, so that you have blackouts. That sometimes you wake up on the trading, or you arrive on the trading floor and you just go straight to the trader's room and you sleep off the morning because you're so hungover from the day before. I wouldn't go back to the office. I'd disappear. I'd go home. I'd turn my phones off.
Continuing with a life of covering up so that there is no admission of failure or mistakes can have tremendous pressures on the individual. This lack of self-control and excesses would result in the decision-making becoming faulty. And so it is a cycle of ineffective performance.
And as he was placing bigger and bigger bets in order to make up for those losses, he was doubling up and doubling up and doubling up. And so over those months, you went from tens of millions to high hundreds of millions as each bet doubled. So an astonishing sort of acceleration to failure over relatively few months.
The men working behind these black glass windows were pouring their money into a black hole. In the first 2 months of 1995 alone, Barings Bank sent over $800 million to Nick Leeson. This was twice the capital of the entire Barings Group. Crucially, they thought Leeson was hedging his bets, and every trade was backed up by cash from existing clients, making them seem like risk-free investments.
They were, in risk terms, described as risk-free because they were equal and offsetting contracts, and therefore there was no price exposure for the bank. The case was utterly different, which was that Nick had set up an account of the banks, which was not reported, and all the positions he took, there was no counterparty.
One of the big lessons out of Barings is to challenge not just where you lose your money, but where you make your money. If they had challenged more where these profits were coming from, it wasn't possible to make the money that they imagined that they were making from relatively narrow margins on major transactions that were taking place.
The progressive trading at Barings Securities was a world away from the traditional banking Barings Brothers was used to.
And there were a lot of people who'd probably been in Brothers for the last 20 or 30 years. They were given jobs for the boys to a certain extent, and that meant that the challenge and the investigation, the interrogation that should have gone on didn't happen because they didn't understand the business.
Did senior management know enough about futures trading? No, it did not. What it did know, or thought it knew, was that it had a cadre of senior management reporting to it that were expert in these areas. Which is, of course, is the way virtually every commercial or financial organisation work, because the top of any company doesn't know everything that goes on in a company, and certainly couldn't perform all the functions in it.
The Brothers guy could turn round to the other 4 or 5 people in the room and pretty much say off, right? To leave it alone. It was the biggest money-making part of the firm, and don't ask stupid questions.
So were senior management blinded by the allure of Leeson's profits?
Well, I can only really speak for myself, and the answer is no. I wasn't. But I was blinkered or blinded by the fact that those who were directly involved in the activity, both the traders and the accounting staff and so on and so forth, expressed confidence in what was going on.
By that time, there was something perverse happening, that the very scale of the fraud had made him into such an important person that nobody could question him. That if anybody questioned him because he appeared to be such a valuable figure, he could simply tell them to stop asking questions and they would back down.
But in February 1995, Barings auditors examined the accounts in greater detail. They noticed an unusually high debtors figure of nearly $80 million. On the 6th of February, the bank's treasurer, Tony Hawes, and his junior clerk arrived in Singapore. Their brief was to find out why Leeson was spending so much money.
I don't think Tony Hawes ever met me in Singapore. Didn't understand the business, didn't understand how it fitted together. Again, another Brothers employee.
But Leeson had become an expert at deflecting unwanted attention.
Singapore was a bit of a party town at that time for the senior managers coming through Asia. And again, you know, it all goes back to avoidance, you know. Avoid them getting to the trading floor and make sure that they can't really interrogate what's going on. One way to make people avoid looking too heavily on what was going on the trading floor was to meet them from the plane, take them for a few beers, get them whatever they wanted, make sure that the next morning they had a hangover so they didn't come to the trading floor until late, and then put them on the plane out of there to whichever jurisdiction they were going to next. And that was repeated time after time after time.
Tony Hawes stayed slightly longer, but he still left Singapore after a week. He failed to see through Leeson's deception, but his assistant, Tony Railton, was slightly more suspicious.
That the pressure is really building. Tony Railton had been there for 23, 24 days. Was he an immediate threat to me? It didn't appear that, on the basis that he was a very junior person in relation to me, and the likelihood was that I was going to be able to fob him off for a little bit longer.
On the 13th of February 1995, Railton wrote, "If you close out all the positions, there is no way on God's earth that you could actually return all the yen." Barings Brothers knew there was a big problem, and only Nick Leeson could account for it.
I knew that that was the day. That was the day that I had to go.
Finally, after more than 2.5 years, Barings senior management was suspicious of the large amounts Nick Leeson was trading. And Leeson was running out of excuses.
The vultures are circling and they're getting closer, and you're running out of energy and they're about to swoop down and kill you. In my own mind, whether I was surviving day by day at this time, it was hour by hour, because there was somebody in the office with me or who was present in the office looking through the reports.
That morning, rumours of Barings' problems filtered through to the Cymex trading floor. As ever, all eyes were on Leeson, but today it was for a very different reason.
On Thursday, there was rumours speculating on the floor that Baring about to go under. And with Baring holding such a big position, naturally the market would collapse. I was trading from the pit, and the Baring booth was very close to the pit. And he was very nervous, kept staring at the screen. And then he started tearing the trading card into small pieces, put them in his mouth, and started chewing them.
Tony Railton was still on Leeson's case. He finally tracked him down and arranged a meeting with him at 4 p.m. that day.
When I got the phone call from Tony, I knew that that was the day. That was the day that I had to go. The position discrepancy has been exposed. There is no explanation. I have to go. Now, it's fight or flight, I suppose. It's a normal physiological reaction. Are you going to fight this and stay, or are you going to run? And I chose to run.
And suddenly, the full extent of the situation hit the Barings management.
The beginning of the end was when the senior guy who was the head of settlements for the investment banking group came to find me in my office in London. And he reported to me that they had found records of which we were unaware, letters and so on that had been cut up so that he could create falsified documents to send to auditors, and so on. Holy. So I hit the panic button.
Alan Bloom and his team of auditors were rushed in to try and save the bank. They uncovered the horrific reality concealed in Leeson's secret 5/8 account.
The losses are ultimately 800 million. It's very clear at that point, and very clear to the board of Barings, that they can't possibly fund those losses from within the resources that were available to Barings. And the issue was, could they find somebody to invest in what was effectively an out-of-control situation with a sort of bottomless pit of unidentifiable losses?
News of the collapse breaks around the world. But the man at the centre of the scandal, Nick Leeson, has vanished into thin air. Journalist Conrad Raj was hot on the case.
A friend of mine, a stockbroker, called and said, "Hey, do you know there's been a disaster? A bank has lost more than $1 billion." I went first to Barings. It was sort of closed doors, so we couldn't get access.
Of course, it was still a shock to us that a bank of that sort of history and of that sort of size could just, went under because of one single trade, because of this trade that is happening in Singapore, not anywhere else in the world, but in Singapore.
But the million-dollar question remained unanswered. Where was Nick Leeson?
I went back to our apartment and told my wife that she needed to pack a bag and that we needed to leave. She was confused, but again, I wasn't given much detail. We just drove our car to the airport and boarded the first flight out.
An international manhunt was on for Leeson, and Conrad Raj got a global scoop on his first location.
I got to know many of the investigators. So one of them called me up and said, "Hey, I got some great scoop for you. Here is a fax from him, from Regent Hotel in Kuala Lumpur." He was making excuses for what he did, and he sounded like he was suicidal and half wanting to give up, half wanting to run.
Consciously, I can't remember what the need was to write on that. For me, I suppose it was some form of closing the episode. In terms of, I respected an awful lot of the people that I worked for. And I think I owed them an apology because they did rely on me and they trusted me. And I broke all of those trusts.
Shudder went down my spine at that point. A sense that you are standing at a point in history. This is not just any other bank, any other institution. This was, one of the most famous financial institutions in the UK, indeed in the world, and a sense of almost disbelief that it could come to this.
I will blame myself till the day I die for the fact that it happened on my watch.
I went down into the local newsagents and picked up the newspaper, the Asian Wall Street Journal, and the headline was "British Bank Collapses." And, you're taken aback and starting to read the body of it and speed reading it as quickly as possible to try and get to the salient details. And then slowly it starts to dawn on me that that's what's happened. I've caused the collapse of the bank.
On Monday morning, the Cymex reopened for trading, but Barings Securities' booth was empty. Britain's oldest merchant bank and its 233-year tradition was now part of history. What was left of the Barings name was bought by Dutch bank ING for £1. But Leeson didn't care. He was desperately trying to get back to the UK.
Every exit gate, there's a TV above it, and the news is constantly being played through it, and the news is all about me. And then, it was the time to board the flight, and you're approaching the gate, and again, you're holding hands and you're panicked. You're complete and utter panic because, again, your face is above those TV screens. The attendants come around with the newspaper, and whether it's a French newspaper, Brunei newspaper, Singapore Straits Times, or an English newspaper, my picture is on the front page of every single newspaper. So again, you're hiding throughout the journey back.
What you got to be back, Nick? Leeson was finally arrested at Frankfurt International Airport. Wearing a backward cap and a smile, he was the boy who lost $1 billion. He was eventually sentenced to 6.5 years in prison.
I do sympathize with him. He was a fun-loving guy. In a sense, you almost wish that he could get away and, run off somewhere, some island or other, and live happily ever after. It's perverse, but sometimes it's that underdog sympathy that you have,
The glamour and attraction to the rogue trader still persists. But what is it about the financial industry that breeds this type of character?
It's what I would think of as being a weird byproduct of the financial industry. Traders are put under an enormous amount of pressure. They're given trading books, given an awful lot of responsibility. They are incentivized through bonuses very heavily to take risk. And so not only the psychology of the trader, him or herself, but the bonus structure, what the management expects of those people, it's a very risky and high-octane mix, and it can very easily go wrong.
Nick Leeson, the young, cocky trader from the suburbs of London, will forever be known as the original rogue trader. But in an industry where millions of dollars change hands in an instant, the basic human emotions of fear and greed can pervert each simple decision.
If I'm asked to give you one word to describe my fraud, the only word I can come up with is crude. And the most obvious example of how crude it was that every single trade in the 5/8 account, every single day, went back to London, and somebody, not under my control, deleted those trades every day for a 3-year period. But people were ignoring it. Because again, you go back to a business that's based on profit, and there's an inclination to belief. And the fundamental attribution error is alive and kicking in banking, as it is in many other industries, and the belief is it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen to us, therefore it's okay.
Olympus, an Asian brand revered around the globe. The company took the world of photography by storm in the early 1970s with a camera of uncompromising quality.
This is the Olympus 1970s film cameras. This is one of the aesthetic that I love.
In 1972, a legend was born. The Olympus OM1 was half the weight of rival cameras without sacrificing any professional features. It would be years before the rest of the pack caught up. But then Olympus was hit by a corporate scandal that rocked the business world.
At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. I didn't believe it.
It was 13 years of covering up bad corporate practices from a company that everyone admired.
This is the story of how one of Asia's greatest companies rose from the ashes of one of the industry's worst corporate scandals.
He was going to get to the bottom of what had happened, and Olympus's management did not want that to happen.
Based in Shinjuku, Tokyo, Olympus has made a name for itself as a global player in the world of photography. It also diversified into high-tech medical equipment, establishing itself as one of the leading manufacturers of endoscopy equipment. Anne Valerie Olson, Professor of Business Strategy, uses Olympus as a case study for her students.
Olympus was always known for high-quality products. It actually started in 1919 in Tokyo making microscopes, and so naturally moved on to medical technology devices. And then with time, it started making lenses because it was making lenses for the microscopes anyway. And from there, it went into the camera business and into digital photography.
In 1936, they introduced their first camera, the Semi-Olympus 1.
People think of Olympus as a camera company, but it's really one of the, it's probably the best medical equipment franchise in the world. I mean, it really is. It's like the Google of the endoscope business.
With Japan's economic boom in the 1970s, Olympus strengthened its production base and expanded it internationally with 3 core products: microscopes, cameras, and medical devices.
Well, you can't take a bad picture, Cheryl.
Neither can you with Olympus OM10. So Olympus had a very good reputation. In terms of culture, it was very Japanese. But Kikukawa, their CEO, actually applied a Western management style to the company and was lauded for that. He was a very charismatic person, very well liked, and so the company invested heavily in innovation, a lot more than a lot of the other Japanese companies at the time. What we mean when we say Japanese culture is that we refer more to collectivist cultures, as is the case in a lot of Asian countries. So there's a great sense of loyalty towards one's employer. It's cultures that tend to be quite hierarchical, where one does not question authority and where one goes with what the boss says. So very loyal, very, very strong, bonded cultures.
Kikukawa joined Olympus in 1964 and rose through the ranks to become president in 2001. He was well respected by his peers and was instrumental in pushing Olympus forward in the digital era. And in 2011, he hired their first foreign president and chief operating officer, Michael Woodford. Woodford had already made a name for himself by growing Olympus's international medical business significantly. Kikukawa was confident that he could do likewise at their Tokyo headquarters.
I turned up in the Monolith building at the headquarters of Olympus in Shinjuku, and I was taken in to see Kikukawa. He was a very charming man. He talked to me about, my family, and he knew them all by name. And then he said he'd been running the company for 10 years. He didn't think he'd changed it enough and felt, I could do what was necessary, and would I take the job? And we didn't discuss terms or anything. I just said yes.
In his 30 years at Olympus, Woodford's impact quickly earned him a position heading the company's European business. There, he successfully overhauled the European operations and made it profitable. Kikukawa was impressed with his accomplishments and trusted him.
Kikukawa and the rest of the board were very happy to appoint him, said that Woodford had exceeded all expectations and that he would make a great CEO. And this is CEO of the medical technology devices, so medical devices not of all of Olympus. It was global head.
Hiring a foreigner as president and COO is unusual in the Japanese corporate environment. In most businesses, the practice is to hire employees fresh out of university, who then work their way up the ladder.
And of course, it takes a long time to become a board member of a company. If we look back 30, 40 years ago, basically no foreigners were hired by Japanese companies, right?
But from the start, there were signs that the new appointment might not be all that it seemed. Woodford soon realized that he did not have the power to make fundamental decisions, as Kikukawa created the position of CEO for himself.
When I was offered the job and became president, that's what I thought I was becoming. But
Kikukawa-san had other ideas. The president formerly would have been the CEO, but he made himself chairman and CEO, which I came to realize meant that he controlled the board. You know, I quickly saw that, you know, he controlled all the levers and the board were literally puppets and he was the puppet master. There was no ifs or buts. It's whatever Kikukawa said was the course to be followed.
In 2011, less than 4 months after being appointed president, Woodford stumbled on a long-buried secret about Olympus, made public in a local magazine.
I was in Hamburg chairing the European board meeting, and in a break I received an email from a friend of mine. He said, "Michael, you need to know this magazine, Factor, has made these extraordinary revelations about Olympus."
It had this article suggesting that some of the acquisitions that Olympus made there was something wrong with them. They'd paid too much money to people whose identities could not be really ascertained. So what was the purpose of these deals, was what it was asking.
Woodford contacted his close friend Waku Miller, his translator for corporate relations with the Japanese media, and showed him the shocking allegations.
To be perfectly honest with you, and this is something that I will be ashamed of to the grave. The tone of the magazine is very forceful, it's very sensational, and the tone put me off. I mean, the tone of the article made me not want to believe it. I should have put up a bigger red flag for me than it did. Micah was very concerned about the amount of debt that they had incurred, and I should have paid more attention to that.
Woodford was eager to get to the bottom of the controversial charges, and the only way was to speak directly to his boss, Kikukawa.
And I phoned my secretary, Michiko, and said, "Michiko, can I see Kikukawa, please? It's very important." And then Michiko phones back and says, "Michael, flat as a pancake. Kikukawa-san is very, very busy today," his secretary tells me. "But as you're so insistent," and adds emphasis to the word insistent, "he will see you today at lunchtime."
This was the first time that Woodford realized the limits on his authority inside Olympus. When he started asking questions and he was getting stonewalled, it was a real shock for him to realize that he was shackled in this way.
Woodford was able to get Kikukawa and Vice President Hisashi Mori to meet him in person.
I can remember that lunch meeting, the first time I was to challenge and confront Kikukawa vividly, like it was yesterday. And I walked in and there was a large boardroom table, and right in the center was Kikukawa-san, the chairman, and Mori-san, who in effect managed all the financial transactions of the company.
Kikukawa and Mori sat dead center of a long table.
Where I was to sit was a tuna sandwich. And if you're not Japanese, you may not understand the significance. I mean, everyone knew I loved sushi. But this tuna sandwich, it was still wrapped up. In Japan, you would never leave the cling film on it. There was no salad or crisps around it. It was just you just would never do that in Japan. And I understood, and I was thrown that, it disorientated me that the message for me, and many of the messages in Japan, is non-verbal communication. Kikukawa was the luxury sushi platter at Olympus, and I was the manky tuna sandwich, and I shouldn't forget it.
For Woodford, the message was clear. Without uttering a single word, Kikukawa had made it clear that, as a foreigner, Woodford had no business interfering in Olympus's most sensitive affairs.
And smiling away, and he said, Michael, you're too busy to worry about these domestic issues.
As the president of Olympus, Woodford knew it was his responsibility to sign off the accounts and answer to the company auditors.
So I said, I know that you are very busy today. Can I suggest that I talk with Mori-san alone? He didn't like it. And he sort of huffed and gruffed and left the room, and I was then alone with Mori.
As vice president at Olympus, Maury reported directly to Woodford, who expected transparency and honesty from his staff. Woodford was disappointed that Maury had withheld the Factor article from him and pressed him further on the allegations of 3 terrible acquisitions, including a face cream and microwave company, as well as paying $687 million in advisory fees to an unknown company in the Cayman Islands.
And he just ignored my questions, and it was one of the most disorientating things I've ever had in my life. I started, to get tense with him. And I said, we've bought a company which makes microwave dishes. I mean, we're a healthcare company, Maury-san.
It was obvious there was something very wrong.
So not only were they paying a lot of money for companies that weren't making a lot of money, simply put, but on top of it, they were paying consulting fees for advice that was no way worth that amount of money.
And I got angry, and I got up, and I walked around the table and came very close to him. And I asked him, I said, Maury-san, who do you work for? Who do you work for? As long as I live, I'll never forget Maury's response to that question. And he pointed. And he said to me, I work for Kikukawa-san! I'm loyal to Kikukawa-san!
In 2011, English businessman Michael Woodford, who'd been brought in to modernize Japanese electronics giant Olympus, was being increasingly isolated from company chairman Kikukawa and other senior managers at Olympus. He'd found evidence of serious corporate wrongdoing. Now he had to make a tough decision. Do you continue demanding answers, or do you quietly fall into line? Woodford's mother instilled in him a strong sense of right and wrong when he was still a little boy.
I remember I went to buy some chocolate, and I took some money from her purse, and I thought she wouldn't notice. And when I came back, she was waiting for me, and she had quite a temper. And I thought I was gonna, I was really gonna be in for it. But all she said to me was, you've stolen money from one of your family. What does that say about you? If I can't trust my own son. And, that was seared on my consciousness about, stealing. And even if you could get away from it, what does it say about you?
Praveen Nair is a business psychologist with almost 2 decades of experience.
What tends to drive a whistleblower to speak out would be where they fall within this continuum of justice and loyalty. So if we were to do it like a straight line, and justice being over here and loyalty being over here, the closer they are to the justice aspect would probably make them more likely to speak out.
Woodford's connection to Olympus began with him working for one of their contractors, KeyMed, in 1981, where he ran a tight ship. This was when he first met Waku Miller.
My firm was producing a Japanese language magazine for the British Embassy. One of our stops was the company KeyMed in Southend. And Michael was the president of KeyMed at the time we visited. My first experience with Michael was having them check the reverse English translation of the draft that we'd written about the company. And it was a tremendously trying experience. He was just absolutely obsessive about perfection.
Woodford went on to head Olympus's entire European business.
Michael Woodford was very successful in Europe, and he managed to restructure the European organization in a very solid way. He was also very well known for his compliance issues and regulations. He strikes me as a real goal-getter. Very intelligent, very smart, business smart, but also very well versed to lead a team towards success as a company, towards a financial solid company. And I think that Kikukawa at that moment was very appreciative of that and brought him into Tokyo.
As head of Olympus Europe, Woodford made the region the biggest contributor to the company's profits. It was then that President Kikukawa offered him the presidency.
Michael Woodford spent almost his entire career at Olympus. So he's always had this reputation of being somebody that was very honest, very ethical, and would go out of his way to call on people if they weren't being honest and ethical. He started off initially at Cadbury Schweppes. Before that, he was an intern in a small aerospace company, and there he already had the reputation of a whistleblower. So at the time, he had denounced, I guess is the word, a secretary that had used office stamps to send her holiday post. And he had been asked to leave because of that, and then it had proven to be true.
As Woodford probed deeper and demanded answers of the dubious acquisitions, his relationship with Kikukawa and Mori worsened.
After the showdown over the sushi platter, the relationship between myself, Kikukawa, and Mori deteriorated, but we went through the motion.
The allegations against Olympus had been published by Factor less than a month ago, and Woodford needed to find a way out of the Tokyo office that could allow him to probe further.
You know, I could feel the contempt oozing from them. I've never felt such loathing in my life. I went to Kikukawa and said to him, you know, I think I should visit our factories which lie outside of Japan, and in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in Britain, in America. And he snapped at it. You know, he wanted me out of the Tokyo office as much as I wanted to be out of there. And that was the longest business trip I ever went on. And it ended in September in New York.
By this time, the pressure of the unlawful allegations was beginning to take its toll.
I was drinking a lot by then, just to try and sedate myself. And we went to a steak restaurant, and I got back, and it was around 11:30 at night. And I remember going into the bathroom and looking in the mirror, and I was 5 kilos less than I am now, and dark, you know, inset eyes. But it wasn't my physical condition which was troubling me. I knew my mental well-being, my mental health was deteriorating because, you know, I knew there was this sickness, this problem, but I wasn't sure of what to do. You know, how do I deal with it? You know, the shareholders don't seem interested, the financial institutions, the media. No one seems to, you know, is it me who's mad?
He also realized the board was not aligned with him and wouldn't allow any more investigation into the allegations around these fraudulent or dubious acquisitions.
Woodford was having sleepless nights and was becoming dependent on sleeping pills.
And I remember I had a brown plastic Perspex bottle of sleeping tablets. And I looked on the back and it said, don't mix with alcohol. And I know that's not a good idea, but I thought a worse idea was not to sleep, so I took 2 of them. Went to sleep almost immediately.
If you've worked in a company for around 30 years, you'd feel very close affinity to that company. And to have that company suddenly do something that you're not familiar with or against your personal beliefs, that's almost akin to having a family member go against you. So that would definitely create feelings of tension that could have manifested in mood swings, it could have manifested in sleeplessness, it could have manifested in not being able to sustain positive relationships in your life.
When you're traveling particularly, you become even more addictive, you know, to opening up your emails to see if there's a message maybe your children have written to you.
But awaiting Woodford in his inbox was worse news. The same business magazine had published a follow-up article containing more allegations against Olympus, alleging possible links to organised crime.
But what shocked me, it said that these transactions were linked to anti-social forces, a euphemism for the mafia, the Yakuza. But the idea that there could be people with tattoos and missing finger digits who might want to hurt me, or worse still, hurt my wife, or even worse, hurt my children. You know, I was a businessman. You know, I sent out mission statements, answered emails, and visited factories. I had no knowledge of how to cope with organized crime.
Whistleblowing is not something that is going to be easy for anyone. And normally, whether or not someone whistleblows will depend a lot on their personal characteristics. In Michael Woodford's case, perhaps what was going on is what we term dissonance, cognitive dissonance. And that is basically when an individual holds two contrasting beliefs at the same time, and it creates a lot of tension, discomfort, a lot of mental pressures.
Despite the growing psychological pressure, Woodford continued to press for answers. Having already tried to raise his concerns in meetings and being rebuffed with tuna sandwiches, the revelations in this Second Factor article encouraged Woodford to put his concerns in writing. Over the next 6 weeks, Woodford wrote a series of official emails challenging Kikukawa and the Olympus board.
Kikukawa actually wrote to me and said, Michael, it's not helpful you asking all these questions. I'm sure it wasn't helpful. I copied them to all the board members.
Yet, in October 2011, Kikukawa appointed Woodford CEO as well as president. But what may have seemed to be a positive change was actually hardly publicised in Japan.
I think what's interesting and one intriguing anecdote is the fact that when Woodford was appointed CEO, so even after he was promoted from CEO to CEO position, his promotion was only written up in the English language website and not on the Japanese website.
But in actual fact, when I became CEO, he had blind, utter loyalty from all the other board members who were all Japanese males in the latter stages of their career. Complete blind loyalty.
But the promotion didn't stop Woodford from continuing to ask difficult questions. He wrote his final email to the board, this time copying in an outside auditing firm.
The last letter I wrote in the UK, and I included a report from PwC, an independent auditor, one of the big four, which confirmed the concerns I had. Now, for the other directors, you know, $1.7 billion US had been spent on these three Mickey Mouse companies, and from this consultancy, from a company which went under the name of Axim or ASIS. You know, even if those people were the devil personified, for their own self-interest, the president is asking to bring in forensic accountants.
Within the same email, Woodford explicitly asked for the resignation of Kikukawa as well as Mori.
And I pressed it. You know, you watch the thing, email send. And then I watched to see, because I asked for reply receipts. And, you know, half an hour later, I saw that a Japanese director working in the United States responded and, you know, had read it. And then obviously he had phoned and woken everyone up in Tokyo, and they all started to come in.
Woodford was summoned to an extraordinary board meeting back in Tokyo.
I walk into the boardroom at a few minutes before 9. This, you know, long board table again. But the board meeting has a lot of pomp and ceremony, and there's all these people on a second group of chairs behind in tables, translators and note takers and advisors and all sorts of people. And when I walk in, it was noisy, much more noisy, and it reminded me of one of those wildlife programs with hyenas. It had that feel of hysteria in the room. I was sitting there feeling very uncomfortable, noting that nobody will look at me. this non-verbal communication. And a few minutes past 9, and I start to look at my watch in an exaggerated manner because meetings never start late.
This was the meeting that would change the fates of Olympus and Woodford forever. English businessman Michael Woodford had taken an extraordinary business decision, demanding the resignation of the top man at Olympus, the same man who had given him his job. The board immediately called an emergency meeting. Almost 15 minutes later, Kikukawa turned up.
And Kikukawa didn't come to his seat at the top of the table. He went to the podium in the far corner of the room. So he got this tatty piece of paper out of his pocket and said, today's meeting's to discuss serious concerns about Olympus. And he said, that has been cancelled, that agenda. And the new agenda is the dismissal of Michael Woodford as president, representative director, and CEO. And on the last syllable, all the people around the table put their hands up, supporting the motion that I'm dismissed. I wanted to speak at the board meeting. I had a document I had prepared the night before of questions I wanted to ask, but I was told that I wasn't allowed to speak.
Less than 8 months after being named president of the Japanese electronics brand, and barely a fortnight after becoming CEO, Michael Woodford was left with no choice but to pack his belongings and leave the building. But just as he was leaving, another senior Olympus executive entered his office.
And he's a big guy, as big as me, and he came up to me and he called me by my first name, Michael. Now, I don't mind what people call me, but he didn't normally. It was Woodford-san, or president, in Japanese. But again, it was a way of asserting. And he said to me, give me your computers. And I said, I can't because they've already gone back to the UK securely. He got very angry and then demanded my mobile phones. And I had a Samsung, which I gave him. And I smiled at him and said, I've wiped it. And then I had my Apple iPhone, and I said, again, I got angry and said, my wife is going to be worried, Who are you? Are you a policeman? Are you going to take it off me? I'm not going to give it you.
Woodford's translator, an American who now calls himself Waku Miller, had worked closely with him and was handling his corporate relations with the Japanese media. He was one of the first to find out about the sacking.
They fire Michael because even though he's been in the organization for 30 years, they've discovered to their great surprise that this person is, in fact, unilateral and arbitrary in his management style, and that he's simply not suited to a Japanese organization. He was going to get to the bottom of what had happened at this company, and Olympus's management did not want that to happen.
Woodford left the Olympus office and headed back to his apartment in Tokyo. At the reception area, he noticed several heavily muscled men.
Who are these people? And that just fed my fear. And I'm very particular about the way I pack because I travel a lot. But I just threw everything into this case and was out of the 8 or 9 minutes, and they were still there in the library downstairs. I was sweating profusely. I was starting to tremble. I phoned Jonathan Sobel from there, who was the Financial Times correspondent in Japan. And I said, Jonathan, there's so much more to this, can we meet? And he said, there's a small cafe across the road. And we met in there 10 minutes later.
My first question was, are you okay? What happened? He said there's hundreds of millions of dollars missing. And it became clear that he was worried that he was in danger, that people might be following him or worse. A lot of money had left Olympus. A lot of money had been taken out of this company in mysterious and suspicious ways. He explained what he thought was happening inside Olympus. He presented me with a binder full of evidence to back up his case. And then he went to the airport. He took a suitcase and said, I want to get on the first plane that I can. I don't feel safe. And I spent the next few hours going through his evidence. Of course, I contacted Olympus to get a comment from them. Talked over it with editors and lawyers. And the thing he said to me before he left was, can I trust you to carry this story through? And then 10 hours later, he got off that plane, a plane in Heathrow, and his wife was there with a copy of the FT that she'd bought at the airport, I think, with his story on the front page.
Back in the UK, Woodford was determined to hold Kikukawa and his board accountable. He did as many interviews with the international press as possible, making sure that the scandal went global.
All of them have to go. All of them have to go. If they don't, then that means there's a tolerance of either incompetence or much, much worse.
As well as continuing to talk to the media, he started planning his next direct move against Olympus.
We're making progress.
I'd put together a new board of all Japanese senior figures, but the institutional shareholders, it became clear they wouldn't speak out, they wouldn't criticize Olympus. This is the 3 mega banks and the insurance company. Whilst I'd hoped I could get Olympus back on, the right path, I knew it was beyond my abilities to change Japan. Corporate Japan needed to change. And, I couldn't do that.
Olympus stuck to their story. Their official stance? Woodford did not understand Japanese business practices. A new president was brought in for damage control.
っていうことになりますと、これは医療のこの条件の中ではですね、適切だったというふうに私は考えています。ウドホド氏は本来取締役でありながら会社内の機密情報を全部開示してしまったわけですよね。で、このことについて我々としてはですね、大変な憤りを感じているわけであります。
I think that they were just desperately hoping they could get away with it, that they could contain it, that they could discredit him. The whole way along, they underestimated how much was going to come out, no matter what they said. They would admit only the bare minimum.
That people are basically with one company for all their career, and I think this sort of dominates a lot of the things that we see in the Japanese company. Because often what is called loyalty might also be dependence. There's someone for his career, for his well-being.
And I've heard the Japanese media described by many as sycophantic, that they bow down to the big Japanese corporations and don't want to rock the boat and ask the difficult questions. And definitely from the outside, looking at how they behaved, as a former journalist myself, that's exactly what they were doing in this case.
While the Japanese media shied away from the story, the international media latched onto it. The sheer scale of the fraud meant that the fallout was going to get bigger. Mark Worthington is an expert on how to manage business scandals. After a decade as correspondent for BBC News, he currently oversees crisis communication strategies for several multinational corporations.
Well, the fact that the company was still denying, even when the international media were writing openly about the allegations and referring to the CEO as being the one who was making them, is quite extraordinary. It's hard to see how that could happen anywhere else other than Japan. It seemed a pretty indefensible position, and yet the denials were still coming. And a motivating factor for that can only be the kind of corporate loyalty and that culture that you find in Japan. That was hugely damaging to their reputation. In a situation like this, when a company like Olympus faces these kinds of challenges, the worst thing you can possibly do is be seen to be denying, lying, covering up.
By November 2011, Olympus finally admitted to hiding massive losses. The company revealed that they'd made dubious acquisitions to cover up bad investments since before 1990. It had taken 20 years for their wrongdoings to come to light. Kikukawa resigned 2 weeks prior to the admissions, and Mori was dismissed for his role in the fraud. But this was only the beginning of a massive shake-up within the Olympus board.
In December, retired Supreme Court Judge Kanaka reported, and this a huge report, and described Olympus as a board of yes men, and vindicated the action I'd taken, which then led really to the whole board having to step down at the extraordinary general meeting the following April.
Today at those meetings, for the first time, I had a sense of relief comparable to when Jonathan published, is that this story will be different.
The Tokyo District Court ruled that dismissed President Tsuyoshi Kikukawa and 5 other members of the board had to pay more than $500 million to Olympus. But the damage had already been done. Olympus shares, which remained steady since the scandal broke out, suddenly plummeted by almost 70% in less than a month.
The impact of this scandal on Olympus reputationally, in terms of its finances, in terms of its staff, were colossal and cannot be underestimated. If we start on a reputational level, they became almost the poster child for corporate fraud, corporate failure, corporate cover-up, and their name became synonymous with those things.
The Olympus case raised wider questions on how corporations were managed. Japanese financial regulators had long tolerated a common business practice of hiding losses, known in Japan as tobashi.
What happened is that in the 80s, many companies had some problems growing their main markets any longer, especially after the evaluation of the yen, and the yen increased in value, and maybe some of their overseas markets broke away. Japanese companies looked for other ways to increase their revenues.
Many of these companies made disastrous investments that ended up in massive losses. And when the Japanese bubble finally burst, most of the corporations didn't know how to cover their tracks.
The tobashi was a way to hide those losses in some affiliated companies, maybe with some other companies, so that the losses would not appear in the books of the main and in the statements, balance statements of the main company any longer. But eventually they had to pay up for that. And I think this is then when companies got into problems, finding ways to make up for those losses.
The tobashi scheme was banned in early 2000s, but there are still Japanese corporations that continue with it behind closed doors. In 2015, Toshiba president Hiesao Tanaka was forced to step down at the electronics and computer giant when a similar scandal came to light.
Since the Olympus scandal, there's been a new corporate governance code put in place that recommends things like putting independent directors on the boards of every company, that kind of thing, which had not been common in Japan before that. This effort was underway before the Olympus scandal, but the Olympus scandal, I think, definitely gave it a kind of tailwind that helped convince some skeptics that it was worthwhile to try and repair the reputation for Japanese financial markets and companies.
For a lot of people, there was no sense to leave the company immediately, because the fundamentals of the company and the structure that was in the various regions and in the various organizations was good.
But change was still needed at the top. A new board took over the reins from Kikukawa and set out to restructure the company.
They wanted to go back into the core business of medical clinical division, microscopy products, and the camera products.
They also took a number of steps in terms of corporate governance, reporting, making sure they had external auditors that were really independent and not linked to the board in any way.
The scandal was reminiscent of the collapse of American gas and energy giant Enron some 10 years before. This led to a commitment to the comprehensive reform of business practices, setting new compliance standards for corporate management.
The Olympus case did for Japan what Enron did for the US. So every time you have a scandal, policymakers, shareholders, boards will question the way business was always done and whether it should be done this way. And just like Enron changed the governance policies and the board liabilities and so on in the US, Olympus did the same thing for Japanese businesses.
When we look at Olympus today, it is hugely different to the Olympus at the time the scandal took place. And the fact that trust had been completely destroyed left them with no choice but to completely rebuild, and to rebuild very openly. So we saw the new management talk about total transparency.
In 2012, Olympus released a report to reassure their investors. Led by new president Hiroyuki Sasa from their medical equipment marketing division, and former banker Yasuyuki Kimoto as their new chairman, the board promised to win back public trust and to prevent another scandal from occurring.
They comprehensively overhauled the way that the company was structured, the way that it communicated, the way that it was governed, making sure that checks and balances were in place, but also demonstrating openly to investors and the outside world what was happening. Because in a situation like the one Olympus faced, when you are that broken and your reputation is that low, you're not going to be able to communicate your way out of that situation. You have to demonstrate what you're doing.
A new set of protocols was put in place to regain the public's trust. And it started with the most basic, regulations and signatories.
The way Olympus was recovering and gained the trust back from the public and from their customers was to put regulations in place, regulations on signatories. People, for certain amounts, a certain level of signatures were required, and always in twofold. Others were regulations that all the staff had to sign forms that they will not conduct any wrongdoings with money like briberies or even sponsorships, etc. So everything was very much scrutinized. So once the company was restructured, or the board of the company was restructured, everything recovered quite easily, because the local structures of the organizations were very solid and very good.
Despite the scandal, the public perception of Olympus as a manufacturer of high-tech cameras hasn't faded. And the tech team is still creating new products that keep the brand relevant. Lance Ong is a camera fan who swears by the Olympus equipment range. He's been using their cameras since 2002 and vouches for their quality, which has vastly improved despite the internal mismanagement.
2012, they are the first one who introduced the 5-axis image stabilization, which is the first in the world. And also that is the game changer for the whole mirrorless system, where all other brands start to jump into mirrorless system where to compete with Olympus.
Mirrorless cameras drastically reduce the size of previously bulky DSLR systems without sacrificing image quality. A camera setup is now a fraction of what it used to cost, making photography much more affordable to both professionals as well as enthusiasts.
The greatest advantage for Olympus to go into Micro Four Third, where they make the camera smaller, yet you can still have a digital SLR image quality. This changed the whole ball game, where they become the leading brand of mirrorless. And till today, they are still one of the leading brands for camera system or mirrorless camera system.
Since the fraud, Michael Woodford has published a book, Exposure Inside the Olympus Scandal, detailing his role as a whistleblower in the indictment of the former Olympus board. These days, Woodford works as a consultant for many large companies, advising them on how to prevent the same thing from happening to their corporations.
Signs that Olympus has come out of the crisis are now all around us. Their name is no longer a name that is associated with the misdeeds of the past. Probably the first indicator to the outside world is the share price when the confidence starts to return. And that's the market looking at the steps that have been taken, reading in depth the documents that are setting out the new corporate governance policies, the philosophies of the new leadership.
So 6 years on, they still have a big share of the market in endoscopy and microscopy, and they're doing very well with their camera business. So they were able to turn around and they're doing well again. So back from the brink.
Every year, over 5 million cars roll off Nissan's production line onto the world's roads and racetracks. In Asia, 1 in every 15 cars is a Nissan. Inside the company, it's a cause for celebration.
1億5000万台を超えたということでございます。
But rewind just over a decade earlier, the company had posted a $6 billion loss, and the employees' spirits were not so high.
Nissan cars started to become very common and bland looking.
This idea that if you just simply put almost an infinite variety of options out there, you're going to hit everyone in the market. In so many ways, that was a failure.
I'm here to communicate to you the Nissan revival plan. We will implement the following plant closures: Murayama plant, Nissan Shatai Kyoto plant.
With unprecedented access inside the company, we look at how this Japanese car giant was forced to look further afield for its savior, and find out how one man was able to kick Nissan back into gear.
Resolute approach in front of adversity.
Located in the heart of Yokohama, Nissan's headquarters is a testament to the company's popularity in Japan. The ground floor serves as a public gallery, showcasing their most popular cars. And it attracts more than just your average petrol head. From young fans
息子が車が大好きなので、今日はここに来たいっていうので来ました。なるほど。
to nostalgic old-timers.
ブルーバードに乗ったことありますね、今ちょっと思い出しました。はい。
日産は日常にっていうか、ずっと小さい時からなんでしょうね、馴染んでるって言ったらおかしいんですけど、ある、ずっとあるっていうイメージですね。
This sentiment is shared across the country as Nissan built a brand intimately connected to Japan. It's something that Professor Audrey Chia thinks set Nissan apart from its early rivals.
As a brand in Japan, Nissan is the only car company that has the name Japan in its name. So Nissan means made in Japan. So it carries national pride in its name. There's no other car company that has that kind of symbolism. The best example I have about the emotional attachment to Nissan as a brand actually came from a Nissan employee that I met. And he told me with great pride, my grandfather worked for Nissan. My father worked for Nissan. And now I work for Nissan. So such is the attachment that even some employees have a family tradition of working in Nissan and being proud to be Nissan employees.
そうですね。じゃあ早速開けてみましょうか。
The iconic cars that reflect this history are kept under lock and key in another warehouse. Ryuji Nakayama is in charge of preserving and protecting Nissan's history.
ここはですね、日産ヘリテージコレクションとい
Inside, it's a motor enthusiast's dream, with cars dating back to the 1930s, when Nissan marketed their cars overseas under the Datsun brand name.
アーカイブっていうとどうもドキュメントのイメージありますけれども、こういう車の現物も立派な生きたアーカイブでありまして、ここに並んでる生産者の、7割は、ちょっと整備すれば走れるんですよ。動態保存なんです。輪止め外せばちゃんと今にも動き出す感じがしますよね。一番古い車はこれなんです。ダットさんの12型って言って、私ども日産自動車が創業した年の、製品なんですね。ただこの時代はまだ車はまだ手作りで、年500台ぐらいしか作れなかったっていう、草創期なんですけれども。
Take off with the most exhilarating new car of the year, the Datsun Turbo ZX. Now available with 5 speed.
From 500 cars a year to over 500,000, as throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the company experienced a phase of phenomenal expansion.
Datsun 280ZX.
It was the age of the automobile.
Limited number.
Car ownership in Asia increased by over 10 times. And Nissan was riding the crest of this wave, making a name for itself by producing affordable and reliable cars.
これが初代のダットサンサニーで、これ日本でもマイカー時代の扉を開いたっていうことで随分エポックメイキングな車ですけれども、これもやはり世界中に輸出されて、もちろんアジア諸国、にも輸出されて。やはり日本のマイカーのために作った、そういう要するにサラリーマンの年収でも買えるっていう商品企画だったんですね。
But the real drivers of Nissan's growth were on the racetrack. And when the plucky Japanese car brand took on Porsche and Alfa Romeo and won, the world began to take notice. Wins on the racetrack propelled Nissan from a local Asian manufacturer to a respected global brand. And in America, actor Paul Newman became the company's #1 marketing tool.
Well, they say winning isn't everything, it's just all there is. That's why I won't settle for second best. No, not without a fight anyway. Great cars, great backup, great value. You just can't lose if you're a Nissan dealer.
これ出していいですか？ごめんなさいね。車触るときにはちょっとこういうものを使うんですけども。
In 1971, Nissan's 240Z became one of the fastest-selling sports cars of all time.
そう、こういう全体的な形ですね。本当に美しい。そんなにエロいことをやってるわけじゃないんですけど、でも本当にね、こういう1260ミリっていうこの前高にうまく落ち着いたっていう、これは本当に美しい形だと思います。
One of these sports cars was sold every 10 minutes in the USA.
Z、フェアレディ Z って日本では呼んでます。日産らしさっていうのは結構この車に凝縮されているってよく言われます。みんなのために、元気に走れる、お求めやすくかっこよく美しい、車が大好きなメーカーだと。
Nissan's cars in the US were associated with fun, and they also were associated with sturdiness and strength. And if you are in a big country like the US, sturdiness and strength of the car matters a lot.
But by the 90s, Nissan was veering drastically off course. Classic designs like this seem to be a thing of the past. The company's designers appeared to have become complacent, as Nissan's new models weren't turning any heads.
I think the first signs of Nissan's flagging energy or decline actually came from its design. So we saw that around the late 70s and the 80s, Nissan cars became very commonplace, but they also started to become very common and bland looking.
Nissan was bracing itself for a bumpy road ahead, and the reputation they'd built up over decades was about to come crashing down.
When a company is as large as Nissan was, the spiral down is not immediate. Actually, it becomes obvious probably when it's already reached a critical mass, and it's very difficult to turn around, and it kind of led to a collapse.
With over half a century of history and expertise, Nissan had become a powerhouse of the automobile business, embodying Japanese design and manufacturing prowess.
And you're imagining the wind flowing over the car.
Cuban-born American Alfonso Albeza has been with the company for 30 years, pushing through cars with globally appealing designs.
I'll never forget my first trip to Japan. I walked into a studio and I saw the 300 ZX, a shape that was effortless, simple, powerful, and immediately I saw the power of Japan.
But by the mid-90s, the company was heading in the wrong direction.
Some of the cars of that era struggled in the marketplace. And the way the company reacted was really a kind of hint of what was coming.
As sales figures dropped, Nissan panicked. In an attempt to increase productivity and profits, they flooded the market with a series of bland and forgettable sedans that were aimed at the family market. They were practical cars, but a world away from the sleek designs the company had established its reputation on.
First of all, they had a very strong brand, very strong positioning, and that naturally tends to lead to a certain complacency. You know, marketers like to say that a strong brand buys time. It gives you time to actually make a mess of things, and then to realize you're making a mess of things. It buys patience with customers, and maybe gave them a little bit too much time.
These cars were fairly successful in the US, but in Japan, they were not resonating with the Japanese customers. And then management pulled back, and we started chasing other companies. Maybe Isuzu has an interesting SUV. So then that fundamentally changed our vision of SUV.
The SUV, or sports utility vehicle, hit the roads in the mid-90s and began to dominate the market.
Swim with dolphins.
Nissan's Asian rivals, Toyota and Honda, moved quickly to add this new must-have car to their arsenal. Yet Nissan delayed. They dismissed the SUV as a passing fad and only released the SUV years later.
I think that that's the part we lost in the 90s, that yes, some of the modern cars stumbled, but then our reaction wasn't rational. Our reaction was reactive and maybe lacked depth. So this is, I think, one of the reasons that happened. And we lost confidence as a company. A company that loses confidence loses focus.
In 1993, Nissan posted a $1 billion loss, the first time the company hadn't turned a profit in 50 years. 12 months later, the losses doubled, and in subsequent years, Nissan were forced to make plant closures and staff layoffs. Now, being offered a portfolio of uninspiring cars, the loyal fans of Nissan were also turning away from the brand. Dino Dale Carbonare's labour of love is his Nissan GTR. From his workshop just outside Tokyo, he's painstakingly upgraded and re-upgraded the car over the last 20 years.
I think I've been playing around with the car pretty much since I
bought it new in '99, so it's been kind of simple mods initially for the first 10 years or so. The way the older engines feel, it just adds to the whole, I guess, character of the car and the way it feels when you drive it. It's just a more satisfying drive for me.
So what did this superfan think of Nissan's cars in the 90s?
I don't think they were exciting design-wise, that's for sure. I mean, it was very boxy designs, big four-door sedans and saloons. And in the 80s and 90s, if you saw somebody driving a Mercedes, you would automatically assume that he was like a successful businessman. Whether if you were just driving a Nissan, just very common, nothing special there.
And these unexciting cars revealed far more about the problems inside the company.
It's more than a car. It's an attitude.
The customer's first glance at an automobile, of course, is heavily reliant on design. When a design is great, not only they feel that the company is cutting edge, but then also the relationship of design and engineering is seamless. So generally, design, I think, is a reflection of the health of the company.
But Nissan was far from a healthy company. Their cars were symptomatic of an organization that chose to prioritize engineering over design.
Technology in itself is only an enabler. It's the uses that we put that technology to. And if you glorify the technology, take excessive pride in that, what you're doing is very often engaging in engineer self-satisfaction that's completely disconnected from the regards of the customers. The die-hard Nissan lovers of earlier generations admired Nissan for its pizzazz, its flair, panache, and performance that grew out of technological capabilities, but wasn't primarily about the technology.
Nissan was stuck in a downward spiral, the company's global sales falling by more than 10% in just 5 years. In a desperate attempt to recapture their customers, Nissan began increasing production.
Customers had this astonishing plethora of options, a dozen different steering wheel options combined with so many different interior options and whatnot. All of that was fine, but the volumes on each of those different parts became relatively low. So your overall supply chain becomes more complicated, the inventory costs become much more complicated, and it just simply drove up overall costs.
In the US, for every Nissan car sold, the company lost $1,000 because of sky-high manufacturing costs. When they should have been streamlining production, they were offering you your automobile à la carte.
I guess the metaphor is you feel much more comfortable going into a restaurant which takes pride in 5 or 6 things they do well, rather than having 120 things on the menu. It's this idea that if you just simply put almost an infinite variety of options out there, you're going to hit everyone in the market. In so many ways, that was a failure.
In 1999, Nissan did the unthinkable. They started shopping around for a foreign buyer to save this proud icon of Japanese business. The French car makers Renault were in pole position. And their CEO, Carlos Ghosn, was well aware how desperate Nissan's situation was.
Welcome. There were many problems. I think profitability was a big issue. The brand was an issue. Second, the international operation of Nissan were completely disconnected from the headquarters. So there was absolutely no exchanges between the regions and the company. A lot of important functions did not even exist, or when they existed, they were really insignificant.
Behind the scenes, Ghosn had found a company that was dangerously disconnected. Nissan had ballooned with design studios, manufacturing plants, and R&D hubs dotted all over the globe. One of them was in California, where Alfonso and his small team of 30 Nissan designers were based.
To work in an overseas studio was an interesting contradiction. We lived in a sandbox. It was a hub of dreams, but we were alone, to be honest. We were an outpost on Mars. We became painfully aware of what was during the spiral down because the company started to need to sell things. The projects would get canceled. We knew the company was in a very shaky position, but we didn't necessarily feel we could do anything about it, that our voice would not be heard.
With debt spiraling to over $20 billion, Nissan was just weeks away from bankruptcy. And with Renault's offer on the table, their hand was forced.
I don't think that the management of Nissan had a lot of choice. It was making an alliance, some kind of an alliance or a merger, or facing bankruptcy. Nissan was very close to it because the bank stopped lending money to Nissan.
Had this kind of funny feeling, all of us, because we didn't know that Renault was in the bidding process. We had heard rumors of some companies, and some companies' denial was painful. Some companies were saying to invest in our company you'd be better off just putting millions of dollars in a trunk and sinking it in the Pacific.
On the 27th of March 1999, Renault bought 36.8% of Nissan. The Renault-Nissan alliance was born, and now the French car company had a big role to play in Nissan's future.
I think that would have been incredibly painful for them. We have to give credit to the president at the time for actually, being prepared to do that. To come out and say, this is our first best option, and anything else is just delusional.
For someone who considers himself a Nissan man, not nice. We're no longer Nissan. We are now needing help, which of course, in the initial days doesn't feel that great. But then you realize, Renault is a design powerhouse. This is our chance to show our power.
The 90s was a decade to forget for Nissan. Registering financial losses in consecutive years, the company had debts totaling $20 billion. But as the new millennium dawned, there was a new hope. Renault President Carlos Ghosn was immediately appointed Chief Operating Officer of Nissan with one brief: to save the company.
Well, I think the first reaction is always a reaction of curiosity about the company, about how the company got to this situation, what are the root causes of the decline of the company. And there was also mixed with that a high level of curiosity about Japan. I would say it was a lot of excitement because the challenge was big.
In Ghosn, Nissan had hired a man with vast experience in the automobile industry. First working his way up the ranks at tyre company Michelin to become their South American COO at the age of just 30. He then joined Renault as vice president in 1996, where he masterminded their successful revival, earning him the nickname Le Cost Killer in the French press because of his tenacious approach to cutting costs. But this would be different. In Nissan and Japan, he was seen as an outsider.
I'm here to communicate to you the Nissan revival plan.
When Carlos Ghosn came to Nissan in 1999, there were many problems that he faced. First, of course, was staff morale, as you can imagine. People were discouraged. There had been a whole series of Japanese CEOs, and here was this foreigner. What could he do for the company? So here's a hard-driving, high-performing CEO, and how was he going to fit with the Japanese culture? I think that was a big question at the time.
First educated in Lebanon before receiving his engineering degree from École Polytechnique in France, Ghosn was familiar with the global market. But in Japan, International CEOs are a rarity, and Ghosn would have to navigate their unique business culture.
You obviously have a lot of handicaps. First, the handicap of the language. In management, communication is extremely important. And when you do not speak the language of the country where you're going to be operating, it's a big handicap. Not knowing deeply the habits of the country and the instincts and the values of the country also is a handicap. But there are also some advantages. Being an outsider, nobody could suspect that you have been accomplice in any way of what happened before.
In Ghosn's first significant press conference, he outlined how he was planning to change Nissan.
At the heart of the revival plan, you have the products. We are car manufacturers, and as long as we are not able to put in a consistent manner attractive, exciting cars, technologically advanced cars, our revival will be precarious.
And he addressed the question of whether he would have full authority as a non-Japanese leader.
What type of problems do you expect to face getting workers to go along, getting the people of the country to go along, especially seeing many of these cuts ordered by primarily what they will see as an outsider?
People in Nissan have really enough of struggling with unprofitable company losing market share. As long as we are focusing on the revival of our company, people will accept why we are doing this. People know that our intention is mainly to put back Nissan back on track.
It was clear that he had been brought in to make significant changes in Nissan, and his outsider status actually enabled him to make some very tough but necessary decisions for Nissan's survival.
True to his management principles at Renault and his nickname Lacoste Killer, Ghosn closed 5 factories and cut over 20,000 jobs.
We will implement the following plant closures. Murayama plant, Nissan Shatai Kyoto plant.
One of the reasons, the most common reason for which a company usually do not make money is they have a very high level of costs. We had a lot of plants which were empty. We had a lot of headcount which was not really needed. And these decisions should have been done a long time in the past.
But there was more to his recovery strategy than just slashing the company's wage bill. He knew he needed to galvanize the demoralized staff. And to do this, he personally visited all of Nissan's sites around the world, even Alfonso's design outpost on Mars.
Very early on, a month or 2 months into the alliance, Mr. Ghosn comes to our studio in California, small, 35 people, middle of nowhere in San Diego, and he sat down with us. He was so curious about what our vision is, what is our understanding of Nissan, what is our connection to headquarters, do we feel empowered, do we feel we can help steer the ship. He allowed us to join in the voices that help steer the company. And this immediately triggered a volunteerism of the team.
One of the wonderful things he did was also to recognize that Nissan had great depth of talent, that the company wasn't in decline because its employees were not good, right? But rather he recognized that there was plenty of energy and potential in the company that perhaps had not been used. And his job as CEO was really to catalyze and energize the company.
Ghosn cut his teeth in the automobile industry as a manufacturing plant manager, so he knew the importance of an efficient production line, especially in Japan.
That had enormous symbolic significance in Japan. There is very much this celebration in Japan, particularly in the car industry, of Gemba, the place, where things actually happen. You go to the Gemba, so you go to the factory floor, you go to the sales floor. And that is the very antithesis of the American-style consulting model, where the smart MBA kids, come in and they tell the company what they've been doing wrong and bring their model, bring their analytics.
Many people inside the company who are engaged into the company.
And in his quest to empower staff, Ghosn was prepared to ruffle a few feathers. He scrapped one of Japan's most traditional business principles, the seniority rule, which prioritizes an employee's age as a reason for promotion.
Nissan was a very traditional Japanese company. Traditional, obviously, when we say traditional, it's not positive. Before, it was impossible. Age was a discriminator. I didn't want age to be discrimination. I want age, on the contrary, to become a factor of respect for senior people, a factor of experience, but certainly not something which just forbid young, high potential to be promoted inside the company.
He kind of came in and he said, well, you folks know exactly what's wrong with this company. You just haven't been able to have honest conversations. So he really just empowered people to speak really frankly. People knew that they had too many plants, that they had too many suppliers, that they had too many models, too many options, that they were paying too much. Everybody knew these things. But in a particular cultural context, you just couldn't have that conversation.
One of the fundamental pillars is that the power comes from within, meaning us, and that our survival, our revival is going to come from us. This is how you get employee buy-in. This is how you get the 120% of attention of your teams.
Ghosn had sparked Nissan's global staff back to life. And now that they were talking to each other again, he made them work together in what he calls cross-functional teams. A technique he first implemented while at Michelin, he would now apply within Nissan.
When I created the cross-functional teams, it's mainly to force people from different functions to work together on company problems. At the same time that I've done this, I mixed people. I took people who are more senior with people younger. We have male, females, we had Japanese and non-Japanese. I freed them from many of the constraints that they had. And they've been an essential tool for the revival of the company.
Rather than feeling helpless and uninvolved and watching the company decline further, they became energized, they became challenged, and they became excited to become part of Nissan's recovery.
To succeed in the world, we must reflect the world. The world is an undefinably diverse community of human beings. And then even many of the markets that we live in are diversified, but our company was not. And so all of these steps of diversity with women, with non-Japanese, I think helped to form a very realistic philosophy of life in our company.
In 2001, just over a year after joining the company, Ghosn announced annual profits of almost $3 billion US. But now, having stabilized the company, he and his vice president of design, Alfonso, needed to modernize Nissan's new cars. Nearly 2 decades since Carlos Ghosn took control as CEO, Nissan are once again one of Asia's top car brands. And today, at their main manufacturing plant in Oppama in South Japan, they're making a big company announcement. The production line has been stopped. The workers assemble, and the nation's media are led in. And here comes the guest of honor.
新型日産リーフが 華麗にオフラインいたしました。改めて拍手をお願いいたします。それでは記念撮影を行います。車両に乗って登場したのは犀川 CEO、山内 CCO です。
日産自動車は1933年に、創業して以来ですね、累計の生産台数が、先月8月の後半でですね、1億5000万台を超えたということでございます。
Hiroto Saikawa took over from Gon as Nissan CEO in April 2017, and he's particularly proud of the new Nissan Leaf.
いうことと、それとこの新型のリーフ、これから新しい歴史をですね、切り開いていくこの先兵となるこの新型リーフ。
And it seems the employees share their boss's enthusiasm.
皆さん、私が構えてと言いましたら、よしと言って構えてください。この新型リーフをお客さんのもとへ届けるために構えて、よし、おっぱの工場一丸となって頑張るぞ、頑張るぞ、頑張るぞ。
But the Leaf is not just any new model. The car symbolises Nissan's return to a position as industry pioneers. A fully electric-powered vehicle, the Leaf was ahead of the curve when it was first released back in 2010, allowing Nissan to get a jump start on their closest rivals.
It was absolutely a game changer, really strikingly so. There was a heck of a lot of criticism of their EV strategy. It was considered to be naive, jumping straight to EV when the battery capability was so limited, all the range anxiety issues and whatnot. Honda would never admit this, but in response to that, Honda went and created a new EV program, Toyota 2. And both Toyota and Honda now look like laggards.
And consumers rush to buy the cutting-edge Leaf. Nissan's sales target for 6 months was exceeded in pre-sales alone before the car was even released.
When we receive word that the entire company is going to bring to the market an electric car that's a real car, 5-passenger, everyday working, it's not some niche thing. We're like, oh my God, like, what do we do? What is this? What is the manifestation of this dream of the company, the dream of the engineer, and how do we make customers who are unaware of this technology aware? So the first Leaf needed to stand alone, slightly outside of our portfolio, because we wanted everyone to notice revolution is here.
Now, Nissan has sold over 250,000 of these cars, making it the world's best-selling fully electric vehicle. But the Leaf has its roots in Carlos Ghosn's revival plan, where the engineers and designers work together in harmony.
Engineers are bringing to us, even while we're sketching, new ideas that they have about making this bullet fly through the air effortlessly. And then all of these things get incorporated. A lot of them are invisible. So all these little tiny surfaces are actually allowing the wind to leave the car cleanly. And this reduces drag and allows the car to go even further.
Since the Renault-Nissan alliance, Nissan's approach to design has changed significantly. Located in the heart of Nissan's modern facility, the work done in their design studios is a closely guarded secret. Nissan's designers are encouraged to experiment with new ideas on all aspects of the automobile, from the interface of the GPS system
サブメニュー的なサブメニュー、はい、音楽とかなんかそういうの設定ができるものとか、もしくはこうスピードとか、スピード出てるんですよね。
To the shape of the cars. And today's designs are a far cry from the box-like Nissan sedans of the 90s.
車のデザイン、まずレイアウトから入りまして、面の表情ってよく言うんですけども、これリフレクションって言って、こっち側から映り込みなんですね。そのラインがどういうふうに流れるかっていうのを考えながらやってます。
the biggest change is that by setting up structures in the company to make ideas become real, this is true freedom. To know that your dream can actually happen brought a sense of responsibility to our teams of designers. And because we knew that these efforts that we're doing, the journeys that we're embarking, actually are going to become real.
車が売られてから5年10年ぐらい皆さん使われるので、その場だけじゃなくてずっと大切にされて飽きの来ないようにっていうのをいつも心がけてやってます。
But whereas 20 years ago, customers turned away from Nissan's models, now they are actively consulted and help solve problems, such as the design of a steering wheel.
意外とやっぱ皆さん同じところで困ってらっしゃるんだなっていうことと、あと車って例えばこうステアリング見てもいっぱいスイッチがあって、こういうのをお客さん全然使いこなしてないっていうのも聞けば明らかなんですけど、聞いてきたことによって社内でもやっぱりお客さんってそう言ってますよって言うと、ちゃんと考えないとねっていう風なムードになってくるんで、そうですね。で考えながらどっちがいいかなっていう時もやっぱ聞いてみてお客様に決めてもらうっていう。今までは上司にどっちがいいですかねっていうのを聞くんですけど、そうではなくてお客様が本当にその状態でどっちがいいですかっていうのを。
This sense of foundation that the customer is our ultimate target, to understand, to be curious about their life, and to understand what their needs from day to day are, but also what the ambition, their dreams are like.
This practice allows Nissan to follow consumer trends much more closely. In Singapore, Nissan now lead the market in so-called crossover cars. Vehicles that combine the style of an SUV and the practicality of the hatchback. Ron Lim, head of sales in Singapore's flagship Nissan dealership, has witnessed this trend firsthand.
Right now, crossover sales make up almost 70% of our total sales. So we can see very strong sign here that consumer preference have changed a lot, and crossover has taken over the position of sedan.
Now, 1 in every 10 new cars bought in Singapore is a Nissan, and the Nissan Qashqai is one of the best-selling crossovers in the country.
Given the crossover fresh design and more stylish design, we are able to capture younger buyers, which is important for the sustainability of the brand.
Yet some Singaporean customers choose to buck the trends.
I think first of all, I'm kind of like a old school guy. I like a lot of retro stuff.
Car collector Mark Chow is part of a growing community in Singapore who crave the uniqueness and style of older models.
I like the shape of like older cars. Like there's hardly any electronics in it. I haven't even got a radio installed in it. So it's a really simple, basic car that's like very reliable. When I drive it around, I get a lot of like, interested looks. People like wondering what car is this from, where is this from, where is it from, or how old it is, or like sometimes people giving me thumbs up in the traffic light. So it's quite nice to know that you're driving something unique.
Please welcome Nissan IMX Zero Emission Concept.
Whether it's classic cars or electric cars of the future, Nissan's reputation is now as strong as ever. In 2016, they recorded an annual income of almost $7 billion, and their profit margins are now 50% higher than the industry average. The man responsible, Carlos Ghosn, stood down as CEO and president of Nissan in April 2017. He joined the company as an outsider and left it as a celebrated honorary Japanese citizen.
He became quite a celebrity, not just because of his success, but also because of his charisma, which was very evident. And a manga was created to document the adventures of Carlos Ghosn, who was seen as a corporate superhero.
Now the company is under the leadership of a new and perhaps more traditionally Japanese-styled CEO, Hiroto Saikawa. Yet, under him, Nissan's values of diversity and innovation that Ghosn strove so hard to implement will be preserved. It's the legacy of an international partnership, the Renault-Nissan Alliance, that ensures that Nissan will remain healthy long into the future.
This was not about political games. This was not about let's be together and then figure out what we can do. This was, there are a lot of things we can do together, so how about we work together?
At the end of the day, Nissan's uniqueness is that we are mixed. We are one of the oldest Japanese car companies, but on the other hand, the spirit of Western partners is completely embedded in our DNA.
I consider myself as the guardian of these values, and I made sure that in every meeting, in every decision, the respect for the culture of people was real, and that every time we were working together, it has only one objective, is a better performance for each company.